There is a moment at the end of every game when the stadium empties and the noise that once felt endless begins to collapse into something quite enough for the truth to be heard. I have always believed that silence is the most honest part of football. It is the moment when the armor comes off. When players walk through the tunnel, carrying the weight of every collision that the crowd will never see again. And when adrenaline stops protecting them from the reality waiting underneath. In that silence, you can tell who is hurting. You can tell who is hiding something. You can tell who has crossed a line that they will never be able to return from. Every player faces that moment eventually. For some, it arrives late in their career. For others, it arrives long before the world ever learns their name. It is the moment I call the final season, even when it happens early, because there is a point when the person a player used to be is gone forever. The body does not fully heal. The confidence does not fully come back. The dreams that once felt bright begin to feel fragile. And the game they love demands a price that can never be paid twice. I think about that moment when I remember the rookie at the center of this story. A young man on the edge of the league, just beginning his life in professional football, still learning the rhythm of locker rooms and meetings and playbooks. Still learning what it really means to survive in a world where nothing is guaranteed. He was too controlled, too measured, too familiar with the feeling of pushing through something he refused to name. Most young players walk into the league almost invincible. Their bodies are fresh. Their confidence is absolute. They carry themselves like men who have never been tested. But he already understood something darker, something heavier, something that set him apart long before the league ever did. He knew what it meant to hide pain. He knew what it meant to be afraid to tell the truth. He knew what it meant to believe that speaking up would cost him everything he had worked for. He also knew that no one in the NFL wants to hear about pain from a rookie. By the time the truth emerged, he had already stepped into a space that could not be undone. The fracture in his spine was not a metaphor. It was not a story crafted for drama. It was a break in the very structure that held him together. A break that should have ended his season on the day it happened. A break that should have sent him to specialists instead of drills. A break that should have put him on injured reserve long before he ever touched the field. Instead, he played. He lined up. He absorbed hits. He lowered his body into collisions that made his life unravel one snap at a time. And he did it without ever saying a word to the people who could have stopped him. He did it because he believed silence was his only chance to stay in the league. When I think about the world he stepped into, I understand why he made that choice. The NFL has never been gentle with rookies. It has never offered them space to be vulnerable. It has never given them the luxury of admitting weakness. Instead, it teaches them from the first day that their job is to endure. To fight through anything, to prove they are worthy of the jersey on their back, to never become someone the team might consider replaceable. And for many, that belief becomes a trap they build themselves. I have met countless men who walked into their rookie year believing they could conquer anything. And I have met many who walked out barely able to tie their shoes. These were men who once sprinted 30 yards without thinking. Men who lifted staggering weight without effort. Men who trusted their bodies completely. Yet when the final season arrived for them, it did not arrive with fireworks or ceremony. It arrived quietly in the hours after a game when they sat on the bench with their head bowed, knowing something deep inside them had shifted permanently. They would never run the same, never stand the same, never walk off pain the same way again. Their final season began in the silence, a tesa, And that is where his began to die. Before the world ever heard his story, before the reports were written, before fans understood the severity of what he had endured, he was already losing pieces of himself every week. He woke up each morning wondering whether the numbness in his leg would fade. He dressed slowly, trying not to reveal how difficult it had become to bend. He moved through meetings with a careful stillness that looked like concentration, but was really exhaustion. Every day became a negotiation between ambition and pain, and every day he chose ambition. Not because he lacked awareness, but because he lacked options. What pushes a rookie to hide the truth? Fear. The fear of losing a job that may never come again. The fear of disappointing the people who believe in him. The fear that speaking up will end a dream that took his entire life to reach. How does pain become identity? Through repetition, through expectation, through the unspoken rule that suffering is part of the privilege of playing football. Rookies learn quickly that pain is not exceptional. It is normal. It is a requirement. And when pain becomes ordinary, hiding, it becomes instinct. How does silence cost a career? By allowing the damage to grow, by transforming small injuries into catastrophic ones, by teaching young men to sacrifice themselves long before the league ever truly knows them, by creating circumstances where survival depends not on strength, but on denial. Silence may protect a roster spot, but it destroys the body that earned it. As the season unfolded, his secret grew heavier. The hits felt sharper. The numbness stretched longer. The pain began to move in patterns that frightened him, but he kept going because stopping meant answering questions he could not afford. And the people around him, unaware of the truth, judged him by the standards the league sets for all rookies. Push harder, show resilience, show toughness, prove you belong. What none of them knew was that every snap he played was a step closer to losing the life he had fought to build. Looking back, the signs were there. Not obvious enough for a trainer to catch. Not glaring enough for a coach to intervene, but present in the way he moved. Present in the way he breathed. Present in the way he stood for a moment too long after each huddle, steadying himself before the next play. It was the posture of a man carrying something unseen, something dangerous, something that threatened his future even as he tried to ignore it. The truth did not remain hidden forever. Secrets in football rarely do. But by the time it surfaced, the damage had already changed him. His rookie season had become his final season in spirit, long before it became his final season in fact. This story is not about a broken spine alone. It is about the culture that allows such a thing to happen. It is about a young man who entered the league full of hope and found himself trapped between pain and possibility. It is about the silence that follows a game and the truths that reveal themselves only when the cheering is gone. Most of all, it is about the moment a player realizes he will never again be the person he was before he stepped onto the field. This is the story of the rookie who played on a broken spine. His journey begins in the quiet. And it is in that quiet that we will uncover what he endured, why he hid it, and how it changed everything. When I look across the history of the National Football League, I see a landscape built on extraordinary talent, remarkable endurance, and a constant negotiation with physical punishment. For generations, players have walked into stadiums expecting to be tested in ways that are difficult for outsiders to fully understand. The culture of the NFL has always been rooted in toughness. It has always rewarded those who push beyond limits, even when those limits exist for a reason. Yet what becomes clear when you listen to the stories whispered behind closed doors is that the greatest threat to a player's life in this league is often not the opposing team. It is the pressure that builds from within. It is the expectation that young men must be more than human long before their bodies are ready. Across decades of research, the data has been painfully consistent. Football is one of the most injury-heavy sports in the world, and the NFL sits at the extreme edge of that reality. Studies published in sports medicine journals report that nearly every player endures some form of physical trauma each season. Some injuries are manageable. Some are career-altering. Some, like spinal injuries, are catastrophic. According to long-term analysis from orthopedic specialists, spinal trauma represents one of the most dangerous categories of injuries in the league. The spine carries the weight of every play. It absorbs the shock of collisions that reach levels comparable to car crashes. Even a minor fracture can change a player's life in an instant. Yet the league continues to operate within a culture that makes silence feel safer than honesty. Rookie players are especially vulnerable. They enter the NFL with dreams sharpened by years of sacrifice. Many of them come from backgrounds where football is not simply a game. It is a lifeline. It is a pathway out of hardship. It is a future they cannot afford to lose. When they step into rookie training camp, they face unspoken expectations that define survival. Do not complain. Do not show weakness. Do not give the coaches a reason to choose someone else. From the moment they arrive, rookies learn that pain is not only tolerated, but expected. They learn that the opportunity they fought for can vanish at the slightest sign of fragility. The pressures of this environment shape everything. They shape how players train. They shape how they present themselves. They shape how they respond to injuries that should command immediate attention. They also shape the decisions that lead to stories like this. The story of a rookie who carried a spinal fracture through practices and games without telling a soul fits a pattern that stretches back through the history of the league. It fits the reality that many former players admit only after retirement. The reality that staying silent about injuries often feels like a requirement. I remember a quote from a retired offensive lineman who once said that during his first season, he felt pressure to hide injuries because he feared being labeled unreliable. He described the culture in simple words. If you told the truth, you lost reps. If you lost reps, you lost a job. His story was echoed by a veteran wide receiver who admitted that he lied about symptoms of nerve pain for nearly half a season because he was convinced the team would replace him if he revealed the truth. These men were not outliers. They were reflections of a system that rewards suffering and punishes vulnerability. Even medical staff within professional sports have acknowledged these issues. A well-known sports medicine physician once explained that the most dangerous players in the building are often the rookies. They push themselves harder. They ignore warning signs. They fear what honesty will cost them. He said that in his experience, the majority of severe injuries he encountered in young players had roots in earlier moments that were never reported. They were allowed to grow because silence felt safer. Journalists who investigate player health have described the same pattern. One investigative reporter who spent years researching the long-term effects of NFL injuries wrote that rookies tend to underreport pain at higher rates than any other group in the league. She cited interviews with team doctors who admitted that diagnosing young players can be difficult because they often minimize symptoms in an effort to remain on the field. Her research illuminated an uncomfortable truth. When the pursuit of opportunity becomes intertwined with the suppression of pain, the consequences can be devastating. This documentary is about those consequences. It is about the unseen world beneath the helmets. The world where players negotiate with their bodies in ways the public rarely understands. The world where dreams collide with limits that do not bend. The world where silence becomes a form of self-defense that eventually turns into self-destruction. Our central figure, the rookie who played on a broken spine, grew up in an environment that shaped his resilience long before football ever did. His story begins not with injury, but with upbringing. He learned early that nothing in his life would be handed to him. He learned that adversity demanded perseverance. He learned that opportunity was rare and fragile. These lessons shaped the way he approached football. He played with intensity. He played with focus. He played with the belief that pain was simply another obstacle to overcome. This belief carried him into college and eventually into the NFL. It also set the stage for the decisions that nearly ended his career. When he arrived at rookie training camp, he walked into a reality defined by pressure. He knew his contract was not guaranteed. He knew roster spots were limited. He knew he could not afford to fall behind. So when he first felt pain in his back, he convinced himself it was nothing. He told himself it was soreness. He told himself it was normal. He told himself he could push through it. What he did not know at the time was that the pain he dismissed was the first sign of a fracture that would only worsen with every hit he absorbed. Medical examinations in the NFL are thorough, but no system is infallible. There are injuries that hide beneath the surface. There are fractures that do not reveal themselves immediately. There are moments when the pressure to perform outweighs the instinct to seek help, and so the fracture went unnoticed. Practices continued. The season progressed. His silence grew heavier. And what began as an injury that should have been treatable evolved into a crisis that threatened his future. This episode will uncover the full truth. It will revisit his childhood and the forces that shaped his determination. It will examine the medical processes that failed to detect the severity of his injury. It will explore the social and cultural pressures that led him to hide the truth. It will analyze the consequences that followed when the diagnosis finally surfaced. It will confront the systemic issues that allow stories like his to keep happening. It will raise questions about what the league demands and what players feel compelled to sacrifice. What gives this story its weight is not only the injury itself, but everything surrounding it. It is the environment that silenced him. It is the desperation that drove him. It is the history of similar cases that reveal how common this struggle truly is. It is the broader narrative of a league where physical suffering often exists quietly behind the spectacle of competition. It is the reality that for every superstar celebrated on Sundays, there are countless young men fighting private battles that few will ever know. As we move into the body of this documentary, we will analyze the season that changed his life. We will examine the details of the injury and the moments that followed. We will explore the human cost of silence and the pressure that transforms dreams into danger. Through his story, we will confront a larger truth about football. The game does not simply demand physical strength, it demands emotional endurance. It demands risk. It demands sacrifice. And sometimes it demands more from young players than they can safely give. This is the world beneath the surface. The world few talk about. The world that begins long before the cameras arrive and continues long after the final whistle is blown. This is where his journey unfolds, and this is where we begin to understand what it truly means to play through pain. I remember the moment the pain first arrived, not as a sharp warning, but as a deep and unfamiliar grip that felt like a hand closing around the center of my back. It was early in training camp, long before the cameras turned away, and long before anyone knew my name. The sun hung low over the practice fields, and the humidity clung to my skin like a second layer of gear. I had already pushed through 2 full sessions that day, and I kept telling myself that fatigue was normal, discomfort was expected, and pain was something other players endured without speaking. Every rookie convinces himself that silence is a form of strength, and I was no different. But in that single moment, when I planted my feet to absorb a routine hit, something inside me shifted. It was subtle, nearly quiet, but it was real. A heat spread through my lower spine, followed by a strange numbness that crept down into my legs. At first, I tried to stand tall, pretending that nothing had changed. I forced myself to jog back to the line. I focused on breathing slowly, on looking composed, on giving the coaches no reason to glance in my direction. The worst thing a rookie can do is attract attention for the wrong reasons. I had waited my entire life for this opportunity. I could not let a single mistake ruin it. But the pain did not fade. It lingered in a way that felt unnatural, as if something inside my body was warning me that this was no ordinary strain. The trainers were only a few yards away, but to me, they felt like a world apart. Reporting pain felt like stepping off a cliff. I had seen rookies disappear after admitting far less. I had watched men limp off the field, only to be packing their belongings by sunset. Fear has a strange way of reshaping logic. Instead of asking myself what the pain meant, I asked what speaking up would cost me. I asked how many players at my position were already fighting for the same spot. I asked whether a single day of hesitation could erase years of sacrifice. And so I told myself that the pain was temporary. I convinced myself that it came from awkward footwork or an overextended rep. I refused to let my imagination consider the possibility that something serious had happened. I finished practice with the same stubborn force of will that had carried me through years of high school workouts and college conditioning sessions. Each drill felt heavier than the last. Every cut felt like I was dragging a weight behind me, but I kept moving. There is a strange sense of pride that rises in moments like that. Not the kind born from achievement, but the kind born from fear. You try to win against your own body. You try to outrun the truth. When practice ended and the players walked toward the locker room, I felt the first wave of real concern. My legs trembled in a way I could not control. There was a tingling in my left foot, almost like it had fallen asleep, but deeper and more unsettling. I told myself not to panic. I convinced myself that ice and rest would solve everything. But deep down, I knew something had gone wrong. Laughter, conversations, the clang of helmets hitting metal shelves, the steady rhythm of showers cutting through steam. I sat at my locker and leaned forward, hoping the pressure would ease the discomfort. Instead, the pain surged upward, and for a brief moment, the world blurred. I closed my eyes and inhaled until the air steadied me. No one noticed, or maybe no one wanted to notice. In training camp, everyone lives inside their own personal storm. Veterans think about preserving their bodies for the season. Free agents fight for survival. Rookies like me live with the constant awareness that a single misstep can erase everything. We learn quickly that pain is a private problem. I replayed the moment of injury inside my mind, trying to understand how something so simple had turned so serious. It had not been a violent collision. It had not been a highlight play. It had not been the kind of impact that draws gasps from crowds or earns nods from coaches. It was a routine rep, a simple block and counter. That is what made it so frightening. If something small could cause this much damage, what did that say about the true fragility of my body? I showered slowly, letting the hot water hit my back as if it could undo what had happened. It did nothing. When I reached down to grab my towel, another sharp pain shot up my spine, this time so sudden that I had to steady myself against the wall. I scanned the room, checking if anyone had seen. No one had. The fear inside me doubled. That night, I lay in the dorm room the team provided, staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come. The pain radiated through the center of my back, shifting every time I tried to adjust. I kept thinking about the stories I had grown up hearing. Tales of players who ignored the warning signs. Tales of men who felt a pop, kept going, and soon found themselves facing surgeries that ended promising careers. I remembered a teammate from college who pushed through a fractured vertebra for 2 games before collapsing on the sideline. I remembered how quickly his dreams dissolved. His locker was empty within a week. But I told myself I was different. I told myself that this was manageable, that the pain would loosen by morning. The fear of losing my spot on the roster pulled me deeper into denial. No rookie wants to believe that the moment he has waited for his entire life is slipping away because of one unlucky movement. So I stayed quiet. Silence felt easier. Silence felt safer. When morning arrived, the pain was still there, stiff and heavy. I sat up slowly, bracing myself on the edge of the bed. The sensation running down my left leg was worse than the day before. Now a mix of numbness and electric shocks. I felt panic rising again, but I swallowed it down. Reporting the injury still felt more dangerous than enduring it. I convinced myself that I could make it through another practice. I forced myself into my gear, each movement sending a quiet reminder of the mistake I was making. Out on the field, the sun felt hotter than usual. I tried to warm up without drawing attention, but every stretch, every twist, every step felt wrong. My range of motion had shrunk. My balance felt off. My body was telling me to stop, yet my mind kept insisting that continuing would prove something. I jogged through drills, clenching my teeth through each rep. I focused on footwork and timing, anything to distract me from the truth. But coaches noticed details. One assistant looked at me with narrowed eyes, studying the slight hesitation in my stride. For a brief moment, I thought he might pull me aside. Instead, he shouted for quicker movement and turned his attention to someone else. Each hit during that practice felt like a coin toss. Every time I lowered my body into contact, I wondered if this would be the moment my spine finally gave out. Fear became part of every breath, but I hid it behind intensity, hoping that effort would mask vulnerability. That is what players are taught from the very beginning. Never show weakness, never show doubt, never let anyone see the fear. When practice ended, my legs shook again. I walked off the field with the same rigid posture I had used the day before, hoping the stiffness would look like determination instead of danger. Inside the locker room, I sat in silence, waiting for the pain to ease. It never did. Instead, it spread deeper, settling into my lower back like a weight I could not remove. That was the moment I should have told someone. That was the moment the injury should have ended my season. But I was a rookie. I was convinced that admitting anything would end my career before it began. I convinced myself that true toughness meant enduring the unendurable. I convinced myself that silence was loyalty. Looking back now, I realized that this was the moment every consequence began. The pain that started in training camp became the thread that unraveled everything. It dictated every decision I made afterward. It shaped the path that turned a simple injury into a permanent wound. It marked the beginning of a story that would follow me long after football stopped. And it all began with a moment I tried to pretend did not matter. The longer I stayed in the league, the more I understood that silence was not an accident. It was a culture that had been built long before my arrival, a way of existing that every player absorbed without question. The NFL does not simply encourage toughness. It treats toughness as currency. It treats pain as an expectation. And above all, it treats silence as the cost of belonging. When I first walked into the facility as a rookie, I felt that pressure before anyone said a single word. It was in the way veterans carried themselves. It was in the way coaches evaluated body language. It was in the way the training room felt like a place of last resort rather than a resource. Everything around me sent one message: real players do not complain. Real players endure. This mentality did not begin with my generation. It began in the earliest days of the league, when players stitched their own gear, wrapped their own ankles, and played both offense and defense until the final whistle. Back then, the sport looked more like survival than strategy. Early newspapers wrote about players walking off the field with separated shoulders or fractured ribs, as if those moments were badges of honor instead of warnings about a violent game. Even as the league modernized, the echoes of that past remained. Coaches from the old eras built their reputations by demanding obedience. And players were praised for sacrificing their bodies without hesitation. Those stories became legend, and legends always overshadow consequences. As a rookie, I grew up hearing those stories told as if they were lessons. Older players in college talked about men who played through broken fingers, torn ligaments, and concussions that blurred their vision. They talked about it with awe. They talked about it with pride. When I reached the NFL, that reverence only intensified. It shaped the way every young player behaved. The moment you entered the locker room, you felt the weight of that history, and it told you something simple. If the legends endured pain without speaking, then you should too. Veterans reinforced that culture without even trying. One afternoon during my first week in the league, I listened as two older players talked about the injuries they had pushed through earlier in their careers. One described a game where he felt a sharp pull in the back of his leg during warm-ups. He knew it was bad. He knew he should have stopped. But instead, he convinced himself that he could protect his team by pushing through. He finished the game, even though he could barely stand afterward. When I asked him what made him keep going, he answered with a calmness that seemed rehearsed. He said that pain was simply part of the job. He said that every player learns eventually that the worst thing you can do is admit vulnerability. Another veteran once told me that the first lesson a rookie should learn is that every player wakes up hurting. He said that if you walk into the training room too often, coaches begin to see you as unreliable. He said that if the trainers know your name too soon, you will not be around long enough to matter. He said that the league teaches you to hide everything because you are constantly competing, not only with pain, but with the perception of pain. His voice held no bitterness. It held acceptance, as if he had made peace with the cost long ago. There were moments when honesty briefly cracked the surface. During a film session, a retired player visited and spoke about his career. His words stayed with me. He said that he had spent 9 seasons ignoring warning signs that now defined his entire life. He said that the hardest part was not the pain itself, but the silence he had maintained for so long. He admitted that he feared injury more than any opponent because injury threatened his sense of worth. When he finished speaking, the room fell quiet. For a brief moment, I thought that silence meant understanding. But as soon as he left, the conversation returned to game plans and assignments. The vulnerability faded, replaced by the familiar expectation that pain should remain private. This culture does not need to be spoken aloud to control you. It lives inside the smallest interactions. I watched rookies tape their ankles without asking for professional help. I watched players take slow steps toward the shower, careful to hide the stiffness in their backs. I watched teammates pretend that the limp in their gait was nothing more than fatigue. A rookie learns quickly that the safest way to survive is to imitate the veterans, even when it harms you. You tell yourself that pushing through makes you stronger. You convince yourself that silence earns respect. You believe that you will lose everything if you appear fragile. I absorbed that mentality faster than I realized. Each day, I felt the pain in my spine grow more persistent. Yet, I carried it like a secret. I convinced myself that if I showed even a hint of discomfort, the coaches would replace me with someone healthier. I convinced myself that the training staff would question my durability. I convinced myself that silence protected my future. The truth is that silence protected nothing. It only deepened the damage. The culture of toughness does not only influence players, it shapes the way coaches speak, the way practices are structured, and the way medical staff handle everything from routine soreness to severe injuries. I once asked a veteran about a time when he reported an injury early in his career. He laughed in a way that told me everything I needed to know. He said he walked into the training room with a swollen knee, hoping for reassurance. Instead, he was told to finish practice and come back later. By then, the swelling had doubled. He said that moment taught him never to go back unless he physically could not stand. A former journalist I met later in my career once told me that the NFL rewards secrecy far more than it rewards transparency. His words echoed my own experience. He said players rarely tell the truth about pain because the league rarely rewards the truth. He said that every rookie faces the same impossible choice. Either you protect your body and risk your career, or you protect your career and sacrifice your body. The league does not present this choice openly. It presents it through culture, through expectation, through the silent hierarchy that every player learns quickly. Some coaches claim that the culture has changed. They speak about the importance of player safety, the value of honest communication, and the need to protect long-term health. Yet inside the locker room, inside the meeting rooms, inside the whispered conversations between teammates, the old mentality remains. A rookie knows that every rep matters. A rookie knows that he is being evaluated every second. A rookie knows that injuries threaten opportunity. These truths override every speech about safety. The more time I spent recovering in silence, the more I noticed how universal this pressure was. Players with sprained ankles would tighten their cleats and continue running. Teammates with bruised ribs would hold their breath during drills to hide the discomfort. A linebacker who once tore muscles in his back told me that the only reason he kept playing was because he feared being replaced. He said that pain became a constant companion, something he carried like an invisible shadow. I remember speaking to a retired lineman who had endured countless collisions. He told me that he realized only after retiring that the league had shaped his entire identity around survival. He said that players become experts at hiding pain because they are afraid of what honesty might reveal. His words resonated with me deeply. I felt the same fear every time the pain in my spine pulsed through my body. Rookies absorb this culture instantly. It becomes part of the rhythm of every day. You learn to walk with confidence even when your legs betray you. You learn to speak calmly even when your back throbs with every breath. You learn to weigh every decision through the lens of survival, not well-being. By the time I realized how deeply I had absorbed this mentality, it was already too late. Silence had become my instinct. Looking back now, I understand that the culture of toughness did not simply influence my decisions. It dictated them. It shaped the moment I hid my injury. It shaped the moment I convinced myself that continuing was necessary. It shaped the path that led to consequences I could not reverse. The league teaches you to accept pain as part of the game, but it never teaches you how to face the damage that silence leaves behind. They can hide behind the calendar that presses teams to prepare quickly. They can hide behind the silence I carried into the room that day. They checked posture, reflexes, and alignment. They pressed along my spine and waited for signs of resistance. I did not report anything specific. I did not want to see the look in their eyes that suggested caution. I wanted to be cleared. I wanted to be seen as ready. In that mindset, minor pain becomes normal, and normal pain becomes invisible. What I learned later is that certain fractures, particularly those involving the spine, often elude detection in the early stages. Physicians who have worked in the league have spoken openly about these limitations. One former team doctor admitted publicly that stress fractures can disguise themselves during routine exams because they do not always appear in simple imaging unless the angle is precise. Another medical specialist explained that incomplete fractures, especially those in the lumbar region, can be masked by surrounding swelling or muscle tension. These explanations made sense only in hindsight. At the time, I believed that if the doctors saw no issue, then I had no issue. The history of the league is filled with examples of injuries that slipped past medical evaluations. One defensive tackle from the early 2000s played half a season before, learning that the pain in his chest was caused by a rib fracture that had been missed during initial scans. A wide receiver once continued through training camp with what he believed was a strained back, only to discover later that he had been carrying a small vertebral fracture that eventually required surgery. A former offensive lineman played for nearly a year with pain that trainers initially dismissed as simple inflammation. Later imaging revealed a fracture in the sacrum, a structural injury that took months to heal. These stories were not anomalies. They were reminders that even with modern equipment and experienced medical staff, the system does not always catch the truth in time. In my case, the gap widened because I said nothing. I told myself that I was helping the team by staying quiet. I believed that being cleared through the medical exam meant that I could trust my body. I needed to believe that because doubt felt dangerous. Doubt could slow me down. Doubt could affect my performance. Doubt could label me as fragile before I ever stepped onto the field. Silence felt easier. Silence felt safer. Silence felt like control. The preseason weeks were intense. Practices demanded precision and stamina. Coaches analyzed every movement, every breath, every hesitation. I felt the discomfort in my spine during sprints, during drills, and especially during the first heavy contact sessions. The sharp pulse down my lower back returned at unpredictable moments. Some days, it felt like a tightening rope wrapped around my spine. Other days, it felt like a deep throb radiating outward. But I convinced myself that pain was part of the adjustment process. Every rookie hurts during camp. Every rookie feels overwhelmed. Every rookie pushes through. That belief was stronger than the fear that something was truly wrong. Trainers watched closely during these early weeks, but they cannot intervene without information. The system depends on communication from the player, and the culture I carried made that communication nearly impossible. When I grimaced after a drill, they asked if everything was all right. I nodded without hesitation. When a coach noticed me stretching my back more often, he asked if I needed a break. I assured him I was fine. Each time I denied the truth, I slipped further into the gap between what the medical staff could detect and what I was willing to admit. He told me that missed injuries often occur not because of incompetence, but because the examination process relies heavily on self-reporting. He explained that athletes are conditioned to hide pain from the moment they enter competitive sports. He said that by the time a player reaches the NFL, the instinct to downplay discomfort has been reinforced for years. He admitted that team doctors expect players to protect themselves, yet players expect the doctors to find issues even when the players conceal them. It is a cycle of misplaced trust that leads to preventable damage. That insight illuminated my own experience. I expected the medical staff to detect what I refused to articulate. I believed that my responsibility ended once I passed the exams. I believed that pain meant nothing until it became unbearable. These beliefs made it easy for the injury to slip through unnoticed. The gap was not one-sided. It was a shared failure between a system that could not see everything and a player who refused to be seen. There were subtle signs that something was being overlooked. I remember feeling a numbness in my leg during a blocking drill, a sensation that lasted only a moment before disappearing. I brushed it aside because it seemed inconsistent. I felt sudden stiffness when getting out of bed, but I blamed the intensity of training camp. I felt a tingling sensation after one particularly forceful collision, but I convinced myself that it was temporary. Each sign could have been a warning, but none of them felt definitive. Pain rarely presents itself with clarity. It arrives in fragments, and fragments are easy to dismiss when your career feels as though it depends on your resilience. Teammates experience their own versions of this struggle. One rookie linebacker told me years later that he had played through a hairline fracture in his foot that team doctors initially missed. Another player told me that he had reported persistent discomfort in his wrist for weeks before being taken seriously. When imaging was finally ordered, it revealed structural damage that had existed since camp. Their stories mirrored mine. Their experiences showed the complexity of diagnosing injuries in a sport where the body is constantly stressed, constantly battered, and constantly pushed beyond natural limits. When I revisit those early days with clarity, I understand how easily I slipped through the cracks. The system was not built to detect every sign of damage. It was built to identify issues that players were willing to share openly. I was not willing. I was determined to prove myself. I let the pressure of competition overshadow my responsibility to my own body. I let the culture of toughness replace honesty with denial. And in that space between silence and perception, the fracture that would define my season went unnoticed. There is a moment every player faces when truth attempts to surface. Mine came late one evening after practice when the pain in my spine intensified in a way I could no longer ignore. I felt a stiffness that made bending forward nearly impossible. I felt a heat radiating up my back that made breathing uncomfortable. For a brief moment, I considered walking into the training room to ask for help. I stood outside the door and thought about the consequences. I imagined losing my rep count. I imagined coaches wondering whether I could handle the demands of the position. I imagined the team moving on without me. The fear of appearing vulnerable outweighed the fear of the pain itself. I turned away from the door and told myself that I would manage it on my own. That decision allowed the gap to widen even further. The medical staff continued to evaluate me based on what they could observe. It was the result of silence that seemed harmless at first, but evolved into something irreversible. I signed the contract and stepped onto the field carrying more than just my pads and helmet. I carried the weight of expectations, of dreams, of a lifetime of preparation compressed into one fragile, non-guaranteed agreement. Rookie contracts in the NFL are a peculiar form of promise. They offer opportunity, money, and the illusion of stability. But in reality, they are built on conditional faith. Every line in that contract reflected the league's priorities: performance, availability, health. Every clause reminded a rookie that the smallest injury, the slightest misstep, could erase the hard work of years. It was a reality I understood immediately when the pain in my spine refused to subside. Non-guaranteed contracts are a cruel architecture of professional football. Unlike veteran deals that may provide security, a rookie's position is inherently provisional. Teams invest enough to claim a young talent, but not enough to protect him against the harshest consequences of his own body's fragility. One misstep, one missed practice, one report of pain, and the team can move on. The rookie becomes disposable. The realization settled over me with the force of an unexpected hit. A former team executive once explained that every contract is designed to incentivize availability above all else. Players who miss practice are scrutinized. Players who report pain are scrutinized more. Every rookie enters the system with a faint understanding that to survive is to be silent, and every silent moment reinforces the unspoken hierarchy of health versus career. I understood this on my first day, and I internalized it as survival. I watched teammates navigate the same calculations. One young cornerback tore a ligament during the preseason and hid it for 3 weeks, fearing the consequences of disclosure. Another linebacker complained quietly to himself, fearing the trainers would perceive him as soft, and eventually, his injury worsened to the point of requiring surgery. The patterns repeated endlessly, and I saw myself reflected in their choices. Every rookie makes this choice, consciously or not. Silence becomes instinct. Survival becomes an exercise in deception, not with intent to cheat, but with intent to remain in the game. The contract created a constant tension between health and opportunity. It dictated how I approached every snap, every drill, every collision. I could not afford to appear cautious. I could not appear hesitant. I could not allow the team to see the moments when the pain flared and threatened to overwhelm me. To do so would be to signal weakness, and in the framework of the rookie deal, weakness equals obsolescence. Even off the field, the pressures of the contract influenced every decision. Every treatment, every stretch, every visit to a specialist had to be weighed against potential perception. Reporting too much could imply vulnerability, but reporting too little risked permanent damage. I learned to mask discomfort in casual conversation, to downplay the severity of each twinge, to make smiles and gestures perform the illusion of health. The rookie contract transformed pain into a private burden, one that existed alongside the physical demands of the sport and the psychological strain of constant evaluation. The financial structure of my deal amplified every fear. Signing bonuses were small, contingent on making the roster. Salary guarantees were nearly non-existent. Every practice missed threatened my compensation and my job security. Every time I took a hit, I calculated the possible repercussions. Could I limp through the next drill? Could I hide the twinge from the trainers? Could I maintain the rhythm that the coaches expected? Trapped does not mean helpless. It means constrained. It means having no option that does not carry cost. That word became the silent soundtrack of my season. Even the culture reinforced the contract pressures. Coaches praised players who pushed through pain, reinforcing the connection between endurance and value. Veterans would tell stories of hidden injuries with pride, establishing a precedent that silence equals respect. I internalized every nuance of this system. I understood that the contract was not just a piece of paper, but a framework that structured behavior, perception, and ultimately, survival. By the time the first game approached, my spine was no longer simply uncomfortable. It had become a persistent, radiating ache that demanded attention. But attention was a luxury I could not afford. I remembered the clauses, the warnings, the examples of players who had been cut for missing practice or reporting injury too early. My contract made silence necessary. It was no longer about courage, it was about self-preservation. I told myself that the pain was manageable, that I could endure another snap, another play, another week. Each moment of silence reinforced my bond with the contract and the culture that had shaped it. I was surviving within a system designed to reward endurance, not honesty. Every choice I made was a calculation. Every moment of endurance was a negotiation with the limits of my body. I hid pain in team meetings, in locker room interactions, in every drill, in every rep. The rookie contract turned my body into a ledger. Every groan, every pause, every tremor had to be accounted for, masked, and absorbed without consequence. The injury became a private equation that only I could manage. The cost of disclosure was clear. The cost of silence was hidden but inevitable. Survival required both courage and deception, and the two became indistinguishable. Looking back, I understand that the contract did more than create opportunity. It created an environment where survival required secrecy, where honesty threatened existence, and where pain became both a currency and a liability. My silence was not mere stubbornness. It was the rational response to a system designed to reward endurance and punish disclosure. It was the way a rookie navigates the brutal intersection of economics, expectation, and physical vulnerability. Every step I took under that contract carried weight beyond the field. Every snap tested not only my body, but the fragile security promised by a document that could disappear at any moment. My silence was no longer optional. It was essential. It was survival. I learned quickly that the league does not wait for bodies to heal. It waits for mistakes. It waits for weakness to show. And it waits for rookies to fall silent. My back would seize after rolling out of bed, and my legs would feel heavier than they should. I reminded myself that soreness was normal. Every rookie goes through this. Every young player feels unprepared, untested, and inadequate at the same time. But this was different. This was not temporary. This was a constant tension in the marrow of my body, an unspoken signal that the spine was under stress far beyond what it should bear. I kept it to myself. I had no choice. To speak was to risk losing the fragile promise of a career before it even began. On the field, drills became exercises in endurance and calculation. Warm-ups stretched into skill repetitions that demanded focus and repetition. Then came contact drills, collisions that struck without warning, bending my body in ways it was not ready to absorb. When I hit the ground after a tackle, I felt a sting that ran through the vertebrae, a whisper that the injury was worsening. I gritted my teeth, rolled back into position, and repeated the exercise. Every day, the pain became less a signal to stop and more a background hum I learned to ignore. I was 22, in the prime of my life, yet my body was breaking down piece by piece. The NFL operates on the principle that toughness is a virtue. Coaches praised players who stayed on their feet through adversity, who continued running sprints after cramps, who laughed off minor injuries as part of the grind. No one questioned my performance. Teammates noticed the grimace after certain drills, but attributed it to soreness, normal fatigue, or rookie inexperience. I learned that perception mattered more than reality. If I looked capable, I was treated as capable. If I faltered, even slightly, I risked the judgment of being weak or fragile. Collisions in training camp are deceptive. They do not feel like career-altering events in the moment. One hit seemed like another, a brief exchange of force that left bodies rebounding, the whistle blowing, the drill moving forward. But the spine is not forgiving. Each jolt reverberated internally, intensifying microfractures that the team's medical staff could not observe without my disclosure. I felt my body compress under every play, the discs in my back taking blows meant for someone more prepared. The pain intensified after exercises I could not even fully articulate. Every time I pushed through, I chipped away at resilience I would later wish I had preserved. I remember standing in the huddle during a particularly grueling drill. My legs shook, my back throbbed, and sweat stung my eyes. I wanted to tell someone that I needed a break, that my body was failing, but the words never left my lips. To pause would have been to admit weakness, to risk the judgment of coaches and the disdain of teammates. I had learned that rookie vulnerability is a liability. Pain is something to endure privately. Endurance is a currency. Every step, every rep, every silent acknowledgement of discomfort became part of the contract I had signed with my own body and with the league. Beyond physical strain, there was a mental toll. I could not let my mind dwell on the injury without fear. Each thought about the severity, about potential consequences, threatened to spiral into doubt. If I considered stopping, even for a brief moment, I risked panic and the feeling of failure. The training camp environment amplifies every uncertainty. A rookie watches every veteran move, every coach reaction, every subtle nod of approval or criticism. In that environment, there is no room for hesitation, for reflection, for self-preservation. There is only performance, endurance, and the silent negotiation between body and ambition. Recovery sessions offered limited respite. Stretching, ice baths, and light therapy only dulled the pain temporarily. Trainers advised rest, massage, and mobility exercises. Yet I refused to admit the real extent of my injury. Rest felt like losing time. Massage felt like admitting that my body could not handle the demands. I convinced myself that recovery would happen naturally if I simply kept moving, if I maintained the pace expected of a rookie. Each day, I compromised structural integrity for perceived progress. I watched other rookies around me break, some physically, some mentally. Knees buckled under the intensity of conditioning, shoulders separated during contact drills, hamstrings tore in explosive plays. I observed silently, noting that those who reported injuries were treated with caution, rarely trust, sometimes with the subtle consequence of reduced opportunity. Pain carries a social judgment within the locker room. To report it is to be perceived as less capable. I internalized this instantly. My silence was not cowardice. It was a strategy embedded by the culture, by the contract, by history itself. The irony is that being young and strong magnified the danger. I had the stamina to keep going, the speed to avoid the obvious, the endurance to perform without visible failure. Yet my resilience created a false sense of invulnerability. Coaches, veterans, and teammates saw the performance but not the cost. The body, however, remembers. My back carried the history of every collision, every repetition, every unspoken cry. At 22, I felt the paradox of youth, the power to perform, the fragility to break. I understood that physical collapse could occur quietly, almost invisibly, while outwardly I appeared unbroken. By the second week of camp, The pain had become more than a distraction. It was a signal I could no longer ignore, but could not voice. Each drill intensified the sharp reminder that my spine was compromised. I began adjusting posture, compensating during runs, altering movements subtly. Every adaptation carried risk. Each shift in mechanics threatened performance and increased the chance of permanent injury. Yet, I persisted. Persistence was the only way to maintain my place on the team, to honor the rookie contract, to sustain the illusion that I could handle everything. There were nights when I could not sleep. The muscles around the spine clenched involuntarily. Pain radiated into the hips, the legs, the chest, creating a web of discomfort that reminded me I was human and mortal. Sleep, however, offered no escape. Dreams were haunted by scenarios of failure, of collapsing during drills, of letting teammates down. Each morning, the ritual repeated. I woke stiff, aching, and aware that the invisible fracture had become more demanding. I rose, strapped on my pads, and returned to the field. Carrying the weight of performance, expectation, and the fracture I refused to name. The perception of my teammates was crucial. To them, I was a rookie learning the speed of professional football, a body adjusting to a level of play far beyond college. They assumed soreness, temporary fatigue, or the discomfort common to anyone under the strain of camp. No one suspected the severity, and I kept it that way. I had internalized the belief that pain could not be discussed without risk. I had learned the lesson that silence preserves opportunity. And so, every grimace, every subtle hesitation, every suppressed groan remained my secret. I became a walking contradiction, performing at peak output while internally breaking down. Training camp stretched on, each day a repetition of endurance and calculation. The spine S fracture deepened in subtle ways that were invisible to the world around me, but increasingly audible to my body. I understood that I was playing a game where every hit mattered. Every drill counted, and every silent moment could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. I was 22, playing for a dream, living through a body in freefall, and learning that the most dangerous collisions were the ones I could neither disclose nor avoid. I learned that endurance alone is not triumph. It is survival. The camp drilled that into me more thoroughly than any coach, any veteran, any playbook could. Every day of silence reinforced the truth. My body was breaking, and the world would assume it was fine. My youth and training allowed me to persist, yet my body recorded every misstep, every unseen fracture, every unvoiced complaint. By the end of the third week, the pattern was undeniable. I had become a walking ledger of unreported pain, a rookie contract and culture of toughness driving me deeper into risk. Survival had a cost, and I was only beginning to understand the price. November arrived with a weight that pressed on every step I took. The season had already tested the limits of my body and mind, but nothing prepared me for the game that would push me beyond the edge. The locker room was filled with the usual nervous energy. It's a quiet hum of anticipation that precedes every Sunday in the NFL. As a rookie, I felt the duality of excitement and fear. The crowd would roar, the coaches would shout, and my body would be tested in ways I could no longer ignore. I strapped on my pads, knowing that each hit, each movement, could either be endured or be the moment of collapse. The first series began like any other. The offensive line surged. The quarterback called the play, and I felt the rhythm of the game in my bones. I moved through my assignments, blocking, tackling, sprinting, the pain in my spine simmering beneath the surface. It was there, but manageable, a background hum that I had grown accustomed to. By halftime, though, I realized that what I had considered endurance was no longer sufficient. Every collision amplified the fracture. Every sprint jolted my back. Every sudden stop radiated a deep, almost electric pulse that reminded me that the injury had not healed and would not forgive ignorance. The hits began to accumulate, each one a test of will. In the second quarter, a defensive lineman met me squarely during a run play. The impact traveled through my shoulders and compressed the vertebrae in a way that made my legs wobble beneath me. I stumbled but forced myself upright. Coach Hayes did not slow the pace. Teammates did not question me. The game demanded continuation. I did. I pressed on. My body was betraying me, yet the ritual of football required that I ignore the signals. I had internalized the message. Showing weakness is unacceptable. By the third quarter, the accumulation became undeniable. I remember a specific moment when I was engaged with a running back, driving him toward the sideline. I felt a sharp compression in my lower back, a sudden electric pain that stole my breath. I clenched my jaw and forced my feet forward. The play ended, the whistle blew, and I realized I had momentarily blacked out. I was aware of my surroundings, but disconnected from the signals my body desperately tried to send. Fear briefly flared, but it was drowned by determination. To stop was unthinkable. To continue was inevitable. The crowd's roar blurred into a background hum. The stadium lights reflected off the field, but my vision tunneled into the immediate task: movement, contact, survival. I could feel each vertebra pressing against the next with every stride. My limbs responded mechanically, a testament to training and instinct, but my core screamed silently. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to scream. I wanted to be removed from the game. Yet the culture, the contract, and my own pride forbade it. Every player understands this paradox. To exist in the game is to endure. To endure is to ignore your own warning signs. Late in the fourth quarter, the sequence reached its peak. A linebacker crashed into my side as I attempted a block. The impact drove through my torso, and I fell to the turf, gasping as the spinal fracture flared with intensity I had not yet experienced. For a moment, I could do nothing but lie there, feeling the tremors of pain radiate outward. Every fiber of my body screamed surrender. I looked up at the scoreboard, at the stadium filled with tens of thousands, at teammates running past, and I realized I was utterly alone in that moment. My career, my dreams, my future depended on standing, on continuing, on surviving. The final minutes of the game were a blur of adrenaline and instinct. I moved through assignments without thinking, my body functioning on reflex alone. The pain was no longer subtle. It was a constant crushing weight, compressing the vertebrae, radiating into the hips and legs, and stealing my breath in shallow waves. I felt moments of detachment, almost as if I were observing myself from outside the body. I recognized that I was performing while simultaneously self-destructing. The paradox was unbearable, yet it was the only option. Stopping would have meant failure. Continuing meant risking catastrophe. In post-game reflection, the magnitude of the ordeal settled over me. My spine was raw, inflamed, and increasingly unstable. I had made it through 90 minutes of elite competition while carrying a hidden injury that demanded attention. My body had endured a load that no 22-year-old should have carried without consequence. I understood that every strike, every tackle, every forced movement had chipped away at my resilience, that the final play had not been a victory, but a reckoning. I had survived, yet survival felt hollow. The cost was becoming painfully clear. Teammates praised performance without understanding the strain behind it. Coaches noted effort, determination, and hustle. No one questioned the tension that had built up in the days, weeks, and now hours leading to this game. The perception of strength had shielded me from scrutiny, but it also obscured the warning signs. The fracture had become invisible to everyone but me, a secret ledger of pain, endurance, and impending consequence. I realized that this was the cruel reality of football. The game rewards performance while ignoring destruction. The physical toll is private, personal, and often permanent. During the locker room debrief, I struggled to walk normally, to find words that would convey what I felt, to hide the trembling in my core. I was exhausted, not just from the exertion of the game, but from maintaining the facade that my body could handle it. The fracture had become a physical burden, a mental trap, and a psychological weight that would linger far beyond the final whistle. I was aware that if I reported the injury now, this season could be over. Each movement I would make over the next days carried risk. And that endurance without acknowledgement can lead to permanent loss. The realization was both terrifying and isolating. In reflecting on that game, I understood the paradox of the rookie experience. Every decision to remain silent reinforces a culture that values performance above health. The realization was heavy, inescapable, and permanent. Every practice, every drill, every snap was now measured against the memory of that day. I had survived, but survival had its cost. My body, my mind, my career had been irrevocably altered. The fracture in my spine had reached a point of no return in the context of endurance, and the rookie contract, the culture of silence, and the expectation of toughness ensured that I would carry this burden in private. The game had pushed me past the edge, and the consequences would follow me long after the stadium emptied, long after the applause faded, and long after anyone realized the true price of performance. The weeks following that November game became a blur of repetition, tension, and subtle deterioration. Pain, once a signal, had transformed into a constant companion. I no longer thought of it as injury. I thought of it as normal. Every morning I woke with a stiffness. Every night I slept with a dull ache radiating from the spine. The injury had become less a discrete event and more a condition woven into the fabric of my existence. It was the quiet realization that my body, my instrument of performance, was compromised. Yet I had no choice but to adapt. To survive in the NFL is to accept pain as part of the routine. I had crossed that threshold. Pain was no longer an enemy. Pain was identity. This shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. I found myself measuring success not by health, but by the ability to continue functioning despite discomfort. If I could finish practice without collapsing, without limping visibly, without drawing attention, I considered it a victory. Every spike of pain became a benchmark of endurance. I started to define myself by what I could withstand, not by what I could accomplish with a healthy body. The psychological transformation was complete. Pain became my currency, a proof of toughness, and simultaneously a quiet prison that I had built for myself. I was not alone in this. Across the league, stories abound of players who internalized injury to the point where pain became normalized. It was just what we carried. It was what made us players. Wide receiver Wes Chandler once said, "There were days I couldn't lift my arms without fire running down my spine, but quitting wasn't a word." The league teaches that to survive, pain must be endured, accepted, and even embraced. Denial is not just psychological. It is structural, institutional, a requirement of existence on the field. The boundary between toughness and denial is fragile. I crossed it gradually. At first, the endurance was conscious. I knew the pain was real, that ignoring it carried consequences. The spine, once a resilient support, had become a fragile apparatus that demanded careful negotiation. I adapted my posture, adjusted my footwork, and altered my movements to compensate. These subtle adjustments allowed performance to continue, yet each moment of adaptation introduced risk. The acceptance of pain became both a strategy and a trap. Every practice, every game reinforced this identity. My teammates began to expect that I would endure, that I would push through, that I would ignore signals my body desperately tried to communicate. Coaches praised resilience without understanding the cost. Silence, again, was rewarded. In those moments, I understood that my self-concept was no longer independent of injury. I measured my value not by ability or talent, but by how well I tolerated suffering. Endurance became synonymous with worth. Pain became the metric of identity. The psychological toll was profound. Chronic discomfort reshaped priorities, altered thought patterns, and influenced decision-making. I found myself calculating every movement. Could I risk twisting this way, bending that way, lifting that weight? The body's signals became background noise, filtered and translated into internal algorithms of survival. Pain was no longer a warning. It was a condition to be managed. I adapted to its presence, learned to navigate its rhythms, and made compromises that would later prove costly. My identity fused with injury, and I accepted this fusion as inevitable. I spoke later with a former linebacker who confessed, "I spent my entire rookie year walking in pain, thinking that enduring it would prove I belonged. I thought toughness was measured by how long you could ignore reality." Looking back, I see now I was just burying a ticking bomb. His words were a mirror to my own choices. We rationalize the cost because the league, the contract, and the culture reward endurance. Pain becomes proof of character, an unspoken badge of honor, and simultaneously a destructive force. The line between resilience and self-destruction is blurred, and rookies navigate it instinctively, often at great personal cost. Acceptance of pain reshapes not only physical experience, but mental frameworks. I found myself anticipating discomfort as a given. I no longer questioned its presence. I no longer considered the possibility of rest or intervention. Pain had become normalized, habitual, expected. This normalization influenced interactions with coaches, teammates, and medical staff. To ask for aid or recognition would have violated the code I had internalized. To speak would have undermined the identity I had constructed, that of the rookie who endures, who performs, who sacrifices silently. Pain was no longer an obstacle. Pain was the framework through which all experience was measured. Rookies quickly learn that identity is malleable under pressure. Every choice, every suppression of discomfort, every unreported symptom contributes to a self-concept based on endurance. The league structures reward this adaptation, reinforcing the notion that to survive is to accept and internalize pain. Over time, the line between normal and abnormal injury dissolves. What was once alarming becomes routine. What once demanded attention is ignored. The rookie learns to navigate life on the field as a series of compromises with the body. Compromises that can have long-term consequences, often invisible to others, but impossible to escape. Veteran players echoed this sentiment. Retired quarterback Trent Dilfer once said, "There is a moment when you stop thinking about pain and start defining yourself by it. It becomes part of who you are. And that's dangerous because it blinds you to limits. Safety, recovery, and health become secondary to identity." And the rookie who internalizes this paradigm becomes both resilient and vulnerable. I understood this intellectually, but could not detach myself emotionally. Pain had become both my shield and my cage, a duality that defined every action, every decision, and every performance on the field. The relationship between pain and identity creates a unique form of psychological conditioning. I became a player whose value was inseparable from endurance. My spine's fracture was no longer just a medical issue. It was part of my professional self-concept. Each step, each hit, each drill reinforced this identity. I could not separate performance from suffering. I could not distinguish between strength and vulnerability. Pain became proof of commitment, proof of belonging, proof of toughness, yet simultaneously a silent architect of damage. By mid-season, the normalization of pain was complete. I no longer registered acute signals of distress in the same way. What once would have prompted alarm now passed unnoticed, filtered through layers of adaptation and rationalization. I understood that the spine could be deteriorating beneath my awareness, yet I moved forward as if nothing were wrong. This adaptation is common among rookies, a silent code perpetuated by contracts, culture, and internalized expectation. We survive through endurance, not disclosure. We succeed by ignoring, denying, and accepting. Pain is identity. Survival is silence. The cost is invisible until it becomes irreversible. The psychological shift was both protective and destructive. By framing pain as normal, I protected my place on the team and preserved the illusion of capability. I avoided scrutiny. I avoided exclusion, and I continued to perform. Yet this protective mechanism simultaneously set the stage for long-term consequences. What was once a signal for caution became background noise, a constant that demanded no action, no acknowledgement, no intervention. Acceptance without recognition transformed the injury from temporary challenge to permanent fixture in identity. Reflecting on this period, I understood that pain as identity is a silent epidemic in the league. Players speak of toughness, but few acknowledge the psychological and physical costs. Former tight end Shannon Sharp remarked, "You walk through training camp with aches that never go away. You convince yourself it is normal because, if you admit it, you're done. You survive by internalizing, and sometimes it costs you everything." I recognized in his words the truth I had lived through. Endurance becomes expectation. Pain becomes proof, and the individual negotiates a delicate balance between survival and self-destruction. I learned that identity forged through pain creates a cycle difficult to break. Each performance reinforced the notion that enduring injury equates to worth. Every successful practice, every unnoticed limp, every collision survived reinforced the psychological paradigm. The rookie becomes a master of concealment, a technician of tolerance, and a strategist of denial. Pain is no longer external. Pain is internalized. Pain becomes identity. This reality would shape every subsequent decision, every interaction, every risk I would take as my rookie season progressed and as the long-term consequences of my choices began to emerge. Football is often described as the ultimate team sport, a microcosm of interdependence and trust. On the surface, it is a choreography of strategy, skill, and timing, where the success of the unit depends on each member executing their role flawlessly. Yet beneath the spectacle, the reality is far more fragile. Players carry hidden burdens, unspoken pain, and silent fractures that often go unnoticed. As a rookie, I became intimately familiar with this duality. My body was deteriorating, and while I moved through practice and games, some of the veterans around me began to notice the subtle signs. They saw cracks in my performance, shifts in posture, slight hesitations that I could not fully conceal. Yet the culture, the pace, and the unrelenting demands of the league created limits even for those who cared. Camaraderie has boundaries, especially when the ethos of next man up dominates every interaction. It began subtly. During one late October practice, a veteran lineman placed a hand on my shoulder as we walked off the field. "You good?" he asked quietly, in a tone that implied concern without confrontation. I smiled and nodded, offering the standard response that every rookie learns quickly: affirmation regardless of reality. Inside, the spine throbbed with every step. I knew he had felt the slight off-balance movement in my block, the subtle hesitation in my footwork. He had seen the cracks, but he did not push further. The culture dictated that inquiry had limits. Every veteran had walked the same path, endured the same pressure, and internalized the same unspoken rules. Concern was tempered by the understanding that some battles were solitary. I remember another moment during a film session. A linebacker, a player with a decade in the league, leaned over the table and whispered, "You're moving differently out there. Watch your back, kid." It was the closest anyone came to directly acknowledging my fracture. Yet even he could not intervene beyond words. The training staff depended on disclosure to act, and the coaches demanded performance without hesitation. His awareness created empathy, but it could not create protection. In the NFL, the instinct to care is constantly at odds with the structural imperatives of the game. The irony was that veterans had survived similar injuries themselves. They recognized the warning signs immediately. The subtle lean in my posture, the way I absorbed contact differently, the micro-adjustments I made unconsciously to compensate for pain. Yet they had internalized the culture as well. They understood that if they confronted me, they risked drawing attention, complicating my own calculations, and potentially violating the unspoken code. The league teaches a kind of empathy that is bound by silence. You notice, you care, but you do not interfere. The rookie must navigate the danger alone. Their knowledge becomes a mirror reflecting my isolation rather than a shield against it. These moments were both comforting and alienating. I felt seen, in a way, without having to expose vulnerability. I felt understood without having to admit failure. And yet, the isolation remained profound. No matter how subtle the glances, the whispered warnings, or the casual observations, the ultimate responsibility was mine. Every drill, every snap, every collision remained a private negotiation between body and ambition. The concern of others could not change the reality of the fracture. I watched other players endure similar crises. Offensive linemen suffering knee and shoulder injuries, running backs nursing ankle sprains, wide receivers contending with concussions and whiplash. Veterans often observed these struggles with a mix of recognition and resignation. They offered advice in cryptic terms, encouraging recovery without commanding it, recommending rest without enforcing it. Caring was circumscribed by the demands of the field, and camaraderie had a ceiling imposed by the relentless pace of the league. There was a game in early December where the cracks were most evident. One veteran receiver remarked quietly, "Something's off. Be careful out there." The awareness of others became a quiet background narrative that amplified my own isolation. I was seen, yet still utterly alone. This duality recognition without intervention created a psychological tension. I understood that others perceived the cracks, yet the expectation was that I endure. The game could not pause for the individual. The team could not accommodate vulnerability. Camaraderie was real but conditional, limited by structural imperatives and cultural norms. The concern of teammates was meaningful but ineffective. Their awareness illuminated my fragility but could not repair it. It underscored the essential solitude of playing through a serious injury, particularly for a rookie with everything to lose. Even the most empathetic veterans operated within the constraints of performance-driven priorities. During practice, subtle glances, gestures, or murmured warnings were the extent of intervention. They could coach, advise, and observe. But they could not alter the expectations imposed by the coaches, the playbook, or the league itself. The culture of next man up dictates that every player is replaceable, that every position must be filled regardless of circumstance. Concern must be silent, observation must be discreet, and empathy must be tempered by reality. The league ensures that the responsibility of survival rests squarely on the individual. I began to understand that being seen by others was a paradoxical form of both relief and burden. It affirmed that I was not imagining the pain, that my fracture was real and noticeable. Yet it also confirmed the boundaries of support. My body was breaking in ways that were visible, and yet the very system that demanded visibility simultaneously prevented meaningful intervention. Camaraderie existed, but only to a point. Beyond that point lay silence, isolation, and the expectation that I continue performing despite the risk. This is the unspoken truth of the league. Empathy has limits, and survival is solitary. Over time, the awareness of veterans became part of a private dialogue that never crossed into action. I internalized their concern as validation, but I also recognized the futility of disclosure. Their observations were like signals on the periphery, warnings that illuminated risk without providing protection. The fractures of the body and the mind remain personal, even when recognized by others. Every collision, every sprint, every blocked tackle became an exercise in endurance, performed under the gaze of teammates who noticed but could not intervene. The league's structure, culture, and expectation ensured that each player carries responsibility for survival alone, regardless of concern or camaraderie. Camaraderie has boundaries. Empathy is mediated by culture, and survival is ultimately solitary. Recognition is not protection. Observation is not intervention. Even among those who care, the system demands endurance, concealment, and perseverance. My fracture was visible, yet the consequences of acknowledgement remained mine alone. These experiences reinforce the central paradox of professional football. One can be both seen and invisible simultaneously. My fracture was noticed but unaddressed. My suffering recognized but unremedied. The balance between camaraderie and obligation is delicate, bounded by the culture of performance and the structural realities of the league. Every rookie learns this lesson, often at tremendous cost. The fractures we carry are both literal and metaphorical, visible to some, understood by few, and ultimately navigated alone. Even as the season progressed, the quiet concern of veterans remained a constant presence. I carried their awareness as both a comfort and a burden. It reminded me that I was human, that my fragility was acknowledged, and that my choices mattered. Yet it also reminded me of the solitary nature of survival in the NFL. In the league, being seen is not the same as being protected. The fractures we endure, physical and emotional, are ours to bear. Endurance is mandatory, concealment is rewarded, and camaraderie, while real, has unyielding limits. The late December air was sharp, the kind that bites through pads and gloves and reminds a player that winter football is not forgiving. We were deep into the season. Fatigue had accumulated in ways both visible and invisible, and the toll of unreported injuries was beginning to assert itself. I had carried the fracture for months, masked the pain, adjusted movements, and endured. I had survived collisions that would have felled a less conditioned body, but my limits were approaching a point where endurance alone could not protect me. There was a moment in one particular game that the body's warnings became undeniable, nearly catastrophic, yet I could not admit them. I could not stop. It was late in the fourth quarter. Our team was down by a touchdown. The stadium a cacophony of cheers and jeers, and every play was amplified by urgency. The coaches were yelling, the quarterback barking audibles, and I lined up for a critical blocking assignment. The weight of expectation of the season itself pressed down on every muscle in my body. I knew the fracture in my spine was fragile, but the drive to perform, to survive, to prove that I belonged outweighed the signal of danger. I moved with intent, my mind focused on the immediate task, my body already betraying me. The collision happened almost instantaneously. A defensive lineman came at me with full force, and the impact traveled up through my legs into my lower spine. For a brief, terrifying second, my legs went numb. Not a tingle, not a dull ache, but complete disconnection. I felt the ground shift beneath me, a disorienting moment where my body refused to respond. Panic surged, the kind of raw, elemental fear that tells you something is broken beyond repair. Yet instinct took over. I fell forward, maintained enough control to continue the play, and completed my assignment. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary effort. To me, it was a brush with irreversible injury. The numbness lingered longer than the play itself. My feet tingled as I ran back to the huddle, the muscles heavy, unresponsive, as if I had been suddenly replaced by a stranger's legs. Every heartbeat sent sharp reminders through my spine. My vision narrowed. My breathing became uneven. The body was screaming, warning me that the fracture had reached a point of acute danger. I understood immediately that this was not ordinary pain. This was the body's final warning, the ultimate signal that survival had limits, and yet I could not act. Stopping meant admitting weakness, risking my position, jeopardizing everything I had worked for. So I concealed it. I smiled, nodded, and moved as if nothing had occurred. The play ended, the whistle blew, and the adrenaline surged. The crowd roared, teammates slapped pads, and coaches called the next assignment. I stood in the huddle, legs trembling beneath me, but expression neutral. The numbness receded slightly, leaving only the ache and burning sensation that had become familiar over months. No one noticed, or if they did not comment. Silence had become part of the currency of survival. Concealment was necessary. Disclosure would have meant immediate intervention, potential removal, and the risk of losing my place on the roster. I hid the warning because hiding had become my strategy for life. Walking to the sideline after the next series, I realized the gravity of the moment. The fracture, which had been manageable for weeks, had escalated to a level that could have ended my career in an instant, or worse. Spinal injuries, particularly in the lower thoracic and lumbar regions, carry risks of permanent paralysis if aggravated. Doctors had explained this during earlier consultations, but knowledge does not alleviate fear. Knowledge only sharpens the awareness of the stakes. I had brushed up against catastrophe, and yet the cultural and contractual imperatives of the league compelled me to continue. I had no choice but to conceal, to endure, and to survive. The team celebrated the play as a successful block, a critical contribution in a tight game. Coaches highlighted effort and technique. No one saw the internal struggle, the near collapse, the numbness that had lasted seconds but felt like an eternity. The discrepancy between perception and reality was stark. To the outside observer, performance was unharmed. To me, the body had delivered an unequivocal warning, one that could not be ignored without consequence. Every subsequent movement carried risk. Every snap, every sprint, every tackle was now an exercise in negotiation between ambition and survival. Later that night, in the solitude of my apartment, I replayed the moment in my mind. The numbness, the disconnect, the sheer terror of instantaneous paralysis lingered like a shadow. I reflected on the months of adaptation, the psychological shift that had turned pain into identity. I understood that ignoring the warning was both necessary for survival in the short term and perilous for long-term health. The fracture was no longer just an obstacle. It had become a ticking time bomb. I had crossed a threshold where endurance alone could not guarantee safety. The body had spoken clearly. I had ignored it. I later learned from team medical staff that such incidents are more common than publicly acknowledged. Rookies and even seasoned players often experience sudden neurological symptoms after repeated spinal stress, yet disclosure rates are low. The culture discourages reporting, and the urgency of performance incentivizes concealment. One orthopedic surgeon who worked extensively with NFL players explained, "The signals are often subtle, but sometimes a player will experience a transient neurological episode. If ignored or hidden, it can lead to permanent damage." Unfortunately, many athletes don't report these episodes because they fear consequences, and the system does not protect them. My experience reflected this reality. The irony was that concealment was both protective and destructive. By hiding the numbness, I preserved my position, my status, and my ability to continue playing. But the decision also amplified risk exponentially. The fracture, already compromised, was now vulnerable to catastrophic exacerbation. The body's warning had been delivered with clarity, yet I had dismissed it. I understood the stakes intellectually, yet the pressure of the league, the contract, and personal ambition outweighed fear. The paradox of survival in professional football is that one must navigate extreme risk with minimal safeguards, balancing ambition against the ever-present possibility of permanent injury. In retrospect, the numbness was a pivotal moment. It was a manifestation of the fracture's severity and a foreshadowing of the long-term consequences that would follow. My mind attempted to rationalize the incident, to frame it as a minor setback, but the physical reality was unmistakable. The spinal injury had escalated beyond ordinary tolerance. Endurance had reached its limit. The rookie who had once believed he could conceal and overcome pain was confronted with evidence that some thresholds cannot be bypassed without consequence. The body's final warning was both explicit and irreversible. Even as the game concluded and the season wound down, the incident remained etched in memory. I continued to conceal symptoms, continue drills, and endure pain, but the awareness of vulnerability had intensified. The numbness had shifted the psychological calculus. Survival was no longer just a matter of performing under pressure. It had become a negotiation with mortality, risk, and the fragility of the human body. Every step forward carried the knowledge that the margin for error had narrowed. The league's culture, which rewarded silence and endurance, now exacted a higher cost. This moment exemplifies the harsh reality of professional football. The combination of injury, culture, and ambition creates a landscape where warning signs are ignored, concealed, and normalized. Rookies, particularly, navigate this terrain alone, balancing survival with ambition, identity with risk. The near-catastrophic play of late December was a reminder that the body can only endure so much before it imposes its own ultimatum. Pain, numbness, and hidden injury are not anomalies. They are inherent to the game. To endure is to risk, and to risk is to define the boundaries of survival. By the time I returned home that night, the numbness had faded, replaced by deep, aching soreness. The fracture was no less serious, the spine no less vulnerable. The warning had been clear and urgent, yet I had concealed it to preserve the season, the contract, and my identity as a player who endures. The incident highlighted the paradox at the heart of professional football. To survive is to hide. To succeed is to endure. And the body's limits are tested continuously, often without recognition. The rookie's experience is a solitary negotiation with risk, pain, and the culture of performance, and the consequences of ignoring warnings are profound and often irreversible. The days following the diagnosis were surreal, almost dreamlike in their intensity. I had spent months walking a narrow line between endurance and catastrophe, and now the reality I had been suppressing confronted me with unrelenting force. Every movement reminded me of what could have been, of the fragility I had ignored, and of the consequences I had narrowly avoided. Fear settled into every part of my consciousness. It was not the generalized fear of injury that every player carries. It was the precise, pointed terror of paralysis, of losing not just a season or a career, but control over one's own body. The kind of fear that silences thought, that compresses time. That leaves a man staring at the ceiling long after the stadium lights have faded from memory. I remember sitting in my apartment, alone, the room heavy with the absence of expectation and the presence of dread. The fracture had been invisible to the world, but now it was starkly real. Fear invaded every corner, the prospect of never walking again, the possibility of permanent damage, and the shattering awareness of how close I had come. My body had carried me through countless collisions, through games where each tackle felt like a negotiation with mortality, and yet it had been a fragile vessel, teetering on the edge. That precarious balance, maintained for months through silence and denial, had collapsed. I was forced to reckon with my own vulnerability in ways I had never anticipated. Anger accompanied the fear. Anger toward myself for having hidden the symptoms, for having overestimated my endurance, and for having treated the body as if it were infinitely resilient. Anger toward a system that rewards toughness above all else. That encourages concealment. That creates an environment in which asking for help is often viewed as weakness. The NFL is a machine built on performance, spectacle, and resilience, and yet it relies on individual sacrifice that is rarely acknowledged. The culture had shaped my choices, and now the consequences demanded acknowledgement. Every thought of the season, every game played, every drill endured became a flashpoint for both regret and fury. The questions were relentless. Why had I not spoken sooner? Why had the warning signs been so easy to ignore, so easy to rationalize? How many others, like me, were walking the same tightrope of risk and silence? Each question reverberated in my mind, compounding the emotional weight of the fracture. The fear of paralysis was immediate, visceral, and personal. The anger was structural, a critique of a culture that prioritizes spectacle over safety, toughness over transparency. I understood, intellectually and emotionally, that my experience was not isolated. That the rookie years in the NFL are defined by pressures that extend far beyond the playbook, beyond the field, and beyond the locker room. Sleep became elusive. Nights were filled with imagined scenarios, missteps that could exacerbate the fracture, collisions that could end everything, the prospect of waking up unable to move. Anxiety crept into every moment of stillness. Even mundane tasks, walking to the kitchen, climbing stairs, shifting in bed, became exercises in careful negotiation with a body that had been pushed to extremes. Fear was no longer abstract. It had a location in my spine, in my legs, in the very mechanics of movement. The awareness of fragility was total, comprehensive, and unavoidable. Anger, however, was the companion that refused to dissipate. It was directed at myself for mistakes made, at the league for cultivating a culture that incentivized concealment, at coaches and staff for enforcing expectations that left little room for honesty. It was a layered emotion, combining personal regret with systemic critique. The fracture was a product of circumstance, choice, and environment. My decisions had been shaped by economic pressures, rookie contracts, team expectations, and the pervasive mythology of toughness. The anger was rooted in the collision between human vulnerability and institutional imperatives, a collision as severe as any on the field. Isolation magnified both fear and anger. The fracture had been concealed for months, and the sudden revelation altered relationships. Teammates expressed concern, but the shared daily grind of practice and performance was interrupted. Coaches recalibrated expectations. Medical staff imposed limitations, and the routines that had structured my existence were suspended. The abrupt shift left a sense of detachment, a realization that the invisible support structures had limits. I was simultaneously cared for and constrained, observed and restricted, understood and yet alone in confronting the physical and psychological consequences of the injury. I began to analyze every choice that had led to this point. Each decision to conceal pain, each refusal to rest, each microadjustment to maintain performance became a data point in a growing narrative of risk. The fracture had not emerged spontaneously. It was cumulative, a product of repeated impacts, ignored warning signs, and a culture that valorizes endurance over honesty. The mental calculus that had seemed necessary to survive the season now appeared reckless in hindsight. The very qualities that had been celebrated as determination now revealed themselves as vulnerability exploited by circumstance. The medical staff's observations reinforced the gravity. They noted that the fracture had been exacerbated by repeated minor traumas, each impact compounding the structural compromise. Neurological assessment revealed that I had narrowly avoided permanent damage. Their clinical tone contrasted sharply with the emotional tumult I felt. The fear of paralysis and the anger toward systemic pressures were not abstract concepts. They were rooted in anatomy, physiology, and tangible risk. The physical evidence made the emotional consequences unavoidable. Fear and anger were now inseparable from the reality of survival. In reflection, the aftermath revealed the complex interplay between culture, ambition, and vulnerability in professional football. The rookie, eager to prove himself, navigates a landscape in which endurance is rewarded and disclosure is punished. The fracture exposed the paradox. Survival requires concealment, yet concealment amplifies risk. Fear and anger are natural responses, emotional markers of the system's demands, and the personal choices made under pressure. The experience highlighted the high stakes of professional sport, the human cost of institutional imperatives, and the psychological burden carried by those who navigate extreme risk in silence. There was also a deeper existential reckoning. The fracture forced me to confront mortality in ways I had not previously considered. Each day became an opportunity to reflect on the fragility of the body, the limits of performance, and the consequences of choices made under pressure. The fear of paralysis became a lens through which every decision, every interaction, every movement was filtered. Anger became a catalyst for understanding the systemic failures that made concealment not only possible, but necessary. Together, these emotions formed a framework for navigating recovery, understanding culture, and reevaluating identity. Conversations with retired players amplified these reflections. Many shared similar stories of concealed injuries, repeated warnings ignored, and the psychological toll of enduring under extreme pressure. One former lineman explained, "You learn early that pain is part of the job. But there's a difference between managing it and ignoring it completely." Some of us didn't survive that calculus unscathed. Some of us still feel the echoes decades later. These testimonies reinforced the universality of the experience, situating my personal fear and anger within a broader context of structural expectation and cultural conditioning. The aftermath, then, was not only personal, but emblematic of a larger system. Anger gradually evolved into a complex lens of critical reflection. I began to analyze how league structures, team expectations, and economic pressures coalesced to create conditions in which concealment seemed rational. The rookie contract, the prove-yourself ethos, the unrelenting culture of toughness, each element contributed to a scenario where honesty was dangerous and endurance was necessary. My personal experience became a case study in the collision between human vulnerability and institutional imperatives, a microcosm of the hidden costs embedded in professional football. By the end of those first days after diagnosis, the emotional landscape had stabilized, but the intensity remained. Fear persisted as a reminder of the body's fragility and the consequences of prior choices. Anger persisted as a lens for systemic critique and personal reflection. Together, they created a dual framework through which I could begin to navigate recovery, assess identity, and understand the broader context of professional football. The fracture was no longer just a physical event. It was an emotional, psychological, and systemic catalyst for reflection, critique, and transformation. The aftermath was not a single moment, but a continuum of reflection, fear, and anger. Each day brought renewed awareness of vulnerability, repeated consideration of systemic flaws, and ongoing negotiation with identity and ambition. The fracture had reshaped priorities, recalibrated goals, and forced a confrontation with realities that had previously been abstract. Fear and anger were inseparable companions, guiding both caution and insight. They were the emotional echo of months of concealment, the psychological residue of extreme risk, and the reminder that the rookie years in professional football are as much about endurance, of mind and spirit, as they are about skill and athleticism. The moment the fracture was confirmed, the conversation shifted from the personal to the systemic. Behind closed doors, the team assembled a series of meetings that I was only partially aware of, yet whose consequences would define the remainder of my rookie season. Coaches, medical staff, and front office executives gathered in sterile rooms, their voices low, measured, and strategic. They spoke in terms of risk, liability, and roster optimization, and it became immediately apparent that my presence on the team was no longer a given. The fracture, while medically alarming, was also a variable in a business equation. My future hinged not only on recovery, but on judgment calls made far from the field by men whose priorities included winning, financial investment, and organizational stability. I would later learn that the first discussion centered on the immediate medical risk. The team physician outlined the severity of the spinal injury, detailing the fragility of the fracture and the potential consequences of continued play. He described the possibility of permanent neurological damage, the critical importance of rest and stabilization, and the timeline for recovery. Coaches and executives, however, weighed these facts against the operational reality of the roster. My absence would require a replacement, adjustments in game strategy, and shifts in salary cap allocation. The conversation quickly moved from concern for health to assessment of my value within the league's competitive and economic structure. One assistant coach voiced concern for my long-term well-being, emphasizing the human cost. Another countered with the stark reality of team expectations, citing prior instances where players had missed significant games and the resulting impact on standings and revenue. The exchange was clinical, detached, and calculated, revealing the unflinching logic that governs professional football. Individual welfare, while acknowledged, was ultimately subordinate to organizational objectives. I was being evaluated not as a human being confronting a potentially life-altering injury, but as a contract, a commodity, and a piece in a larger system. The executives focused on risk management. Insurance implications, medical liabilities, and public perception were scrutinized. They debated the optics of placing a player with a significant spinal injury on the active roster versus sidelining him with an official medical designation. The discussion was devoid of sentiment. The fracture became a ledger item, a variable in calculations that would determine not only my playing time, but also my future with the franchise. My existence as a human athlete intersected with corporate strategy, and the balance between safety and utility was measured with cold precision. Coaches were concerned with performance continuity, They examined the depth chart, evaluated the readiness of backup players, and considered whether my absence would compromise competitive outcomes. I had been performing at a high level, masking the fracture through grit and calculated risk. Yet now, the risk was visible, undeniable, and potentially catastrophic. The coach's dialogue highlighted a tension inherent to professional sports. The desire to win must coexist with the moral. The decisions made in these rooms were decisive, shaping the remainder of my career before I even stepped onto the field again. In the midst of these discussions, I became painfully aware of the harsh reality of expendability. Rookie players, even those who have demonstrated extraordinary commitment and skill, exist at the mercy of evaluation systems that prioritize organizational stability over individual resilience. The fracture had exposed a vulnerability that could not be hidden, and suddenly my presence was contingent not on potential, but on risk assessment. My value was recalculated in terms of the probability of recovery, the likelihood of future contribution, and the comparative utility of alternative personnel. The human cost of endurance, pain, and concealment was quantified and weighed against competitive and financial imperatives. Medical staff advocated for immediate intervention and full rest. They recognized that continued play could not only end a career, but permanently compromise my mobility. Their arguments were grounded in physiology, experience, and ethical responsibility. Yet they were challenged by the coach's insistence on continuity, by executive scrutiny of financial implications, and by the culture of toughness that had framed my own choices. The fracture, a stark medical reality, became a site of negotiation between conflicting priorities: ethical duty, competitive expectation, and economic pragmatism. The weight of these discussions eventually fell to the head coach and general manager, who were tasked with reconciling the competing demands. Decisions were made to remove me from active play immediately, to designate me for medical rest, and to initiate a structured rehabilitation plan. It was a resolution that prioritized survival and recovery, yet the discussion revealed how precarious my position had been. Just days earlier, the fracture might have been dismissed, and continued play could have resulted in catastrophic injury. The fragility of my career had been exposed, and the conversations underscored how thin the margin between opportunity and disaster truly is in professional football. As the news filtered to me, I experienced a mixture of relief, anxiety, and humiliation. Relief that the fracture would now be addressed, anxiety over the impact on my development and future opportunities, and humiliation at the realization of how expendable I had been perceived. The rookie who had endured pain, hidden symptoms, and performed under extreme risk was suddenly faced with the systemic reality that my survival was conditional, my presence negotiable, and my contribution secondary to larger organizational concerns. It was a sobering moment, one that reframed my understanding of loyalty, identity, and the economic realities of professional sports. The broader implications became apparent over the next few weeks. My treatment plan was monitored not only for medical progress, but for compliance with organizational expectations. Every rehabilitation milestone was scrutinized, every movement assessed, and every interaction with medical staff recorded. The fracture was no longer merely a personal challenge. It had become a matter of corporate interest. The alignment between individual recovery and institutional need created a dual responsibility: to heal and to conform to the metrics imposed by the franchise. This intersection magnified stress, anxiety, and the awareness of vulnerability. Discussions with teammates added another layer of complexity. Some expressed concern, others curiosity, and a few implied skepticism about the severity of the injury. The culture of toughness, still pervasive in the locker room, clashed with medical reality. While I knew the fracture was serious, I was acutely aware that perceptions, rumors, and assumptions could influence professional standing. Professional football is as much about perception and management as it is about skill and endurance. This period also revealed the emotional toll of being expendable. I had been performing at peak capacity while concealing a life-threatening injury, yet the reality was that my role was contingent. Contracts, depth charts, and financial considerations determine opportunity as much as talent or effort. The fracture made explicit what had always been implicit, that players, particularly rookies, are valued primarily for their utility and replaceability. The tension between human ambition and institutional imperatives is a defining feature of professional sports. And my experience illustrated it in stark terms. Reflecting on this period, I understood that professional football operates on multiple layers of accountability and risk. Players navigate physical vulnerability, cultural expectation, and economic imperatives simultaneously. Medical staff must balance ethical responsibility with organizational pressure. Coaches negotiate competitive advantage against the human cost. Executives manage finances, risk, and public perception. The fracture became a nexus where all these forces intersected, revealing both the sophistication and the ruthlessness of the league's internal dynamics. It was a moment of clarity. Survival and opportunity are never guaranteed, and the stakes of concealment and endurance extend far beyond the field. The fracture, the meetings, and the decisions created a framework for the remainder of my season. Medical compliance, monitored rehabilitation, and restricted activity became the new metrics for success. Performance, while previously defined by physical presence on the field, was now measured by adherence to recovery protocols. The culture of toughness remained, but its expression was redefined. It was no longer endurance of pain on the field, but commitment to healing off it. Survival, identity, and career trajectory had been recalibrated. The period behind closed doors demonstrated the brutal realities of professional football. Decisions about a player's health, career, and future are rarely made in isolation. They are embedded in a network of performance expectations, financial considerations, and organizational strategy. The rookie who had concealed a fracture now witnessed firsthand the extent to which personal ambition collides with institutional imperatives. Fear and uncertainty persisted, yet clarity emerged. Survival, not spectacle, would define the path forward. The first time I held a football in my hands, I remember the weight of possibility. I was 8 years old, standing on a sun-baked practice field, the smell of fresh-cut grass mingling with the temps of sweat and determination. My father had coached my youth team, a man whose voice could command attention yet offered encouragement in equal measure. He spoke of dreams, discipline, and the honor of earning a place among those who played at the highest level. I remember the pride in his eyes, the conviction in his tone, the sense that this game could shape me, define me, and offer a future that extended far beyond our small town. That childhood dream had carried me for years, a guiding light through adolescence, high school, and college. It had fueled sacrifice, endurance, and an unyielding belief in the power of ambition. I spent countless hours replaying those formative experiences in my mind. As a rookie in the NFL, the same dream that had once seemed infinite now collided with the stark reality of my fractured spine. Each day, I felt the weight of my ambitions pressing against the limits of my body. The league I had idolized, the stage I had imagined, had become a landscape of risk, vulnerability, and consequence. The fantasy of limitless opportunity was shattered by the material reality of injury. My body, which had once been a vehicle for aspiration, now imposed strict boundaries that I could neither ignore nor transcend. The emotional cost of confronting this fracture was immediate and profound. For years, my identity had been intertwined with performance, with proving myself at every level, with embodying the toughness and determination that the league demands. Now, with the injury fully revealed, that identity felt destabilized. Fear, anger, and grief intertwined as I realized that the dream I had nurtured since childhood was at risk of being permanently altered, perhaps ended altogether. The thought of a career curtailed by an injury I had tried to conceal was both humbling and devastating. Family history added layers of expectation and pressure. My parents had sacrificed for my development, driving hours to practices, attending games, and investing both time and money to support my growth. Every youth championship, every high school accolade, every collegiate milestone had been witnessed and celebrated by those who believed in my potential. To confront the possibility of never fulfilling the professional dream felt like a betrayal not of their faith, but of the trajectory we had all invested in collectively. The fracture was more than a physical obstacle. It was a rupture in a narrative constructed over decades, a moment where childhood promise collided with adult consequence. The loss of control was another emotional weight. In youth football, I had felt agency, a direct link between effort and outcome. On the professional stage, the fracture illustrated the fragility of that connection. No matter how disciplined, dedicated, or resilient, some forces remained outside personal control. The body, uncooperative and damaged, became a determinant beyond the capacity of will or ambition. Childhood dreams, once a source of inspiration and certainty, now highlighted the precariousness of existence in a sport that demands absolute physical commitment. The fracture reframed memories of achievement. Plays that had seemed triumphant now carried new significance. Each touchdown, each pivotal block, each display of skill was now filtered through the lens of vulnerability. The league that had once represented opportunity and identity now represented risk, fragility, and the potential for permanent harm. Childhood notions of glory and accomplishment were revisited with skepticism, tinged with the anxiety that the price of pursuing those dreams could exceed the benefits. The very goals that had propelled my life forward became intertwined with danger. I wrestled with the psychological implications of risk versus reward. Playing the NFL had been a lifelong ambition, a defining measure of skill and determination. Yet the fracture imposed a stark question. At what cost does one pursue a dream? The body, once an instrument of success, now dictated terms. Every movement, every exertion, carried consequence. The romance of achievement was now inseparable from the calculus of survival. Childhood aspirations, once untainted by consequence, were now refracted through the prism of physical vulnerability and professional risk. Reflecting on the path to this point, I recognize the cumulative weight of structural pressures. Rookie contracts, non-guaranteed deals, and the pervasive culture of toughness had shaped choices, obscured judgment, and normalized concealment. Each decision to play through pain, each adjustment to maintain performance, each act of self-preservation through denial was part of a system that valorized endurance at the cost of health. My childhood dream had not been naive. It had been nurtured in a culture that did not account for the fragility of human anatomy under extreme pressure. The fracture revealed the collision between aspiration and reality in the most intimate, personal terms. Emotional processing also included grief for the anticipated trajectory of my career. I had envisioned seasons of growth, accolades, and recognition. I had imagined proving myself to coaches, teammates, and fans, carving out a legacy grounded in skill, resilience, and determination. The fracture rendered these visions uncertain. Every projection of achievement, every imagined highlight, now had to contend with the reality of physical limitation. The gap between expectation and possibility created tension, disappointment, and a profound sense of loss. Childhood dreams, once sources of joy and motivation, now acted as benchmarks for what might be denied by circumstance. Interpersonal dynamics were also affected. Conversations with teammates and coaches were imbued with caution, curiosity, and skepticism. Support was offered, but the fracture changed perceptions. I was no longer solely a competitor, but a case study, a test of organizational decision-making, and a subject of concern and calculation. the social fabric of the locker room shifted. The very relationships that had once been defined by collaboration and shared aspiration were now framed by vulnerability, risk, and contingency. The fractured spine had altered not just professional identity, but interpersonal context, reshaping interactions and expectations. Through all of this, reflection on childhood ambition became both a source of solace and a point of tension. Memories of playing under the sun, of hearing my father's voice, of the exhilaration of discovery, reminded me of the purity and joy of the sport. Yet those same memories were now juxtaposed with the knowledge of cost, risk, and consequence. Dreams once untethered and infinite were now bound by anatomy, economics, and culture. The fracture rendered the pursuit of childhood ambition both urgent and perilous, a duality that defined the emotional landscape of recovery and reflection. In retrospect, the fracture highlighted the intersection of personal aspiration, cultural expectation, and structural pressure. Childhood dreams had propelled my life forward, instilling discipline, resilience, and determination. Yet the very system that enabled the pursuit of those dreams also imposed risks that could not have been foreseen in youth. The league, the contracts, and the culture of toughness created conditions in which concealment and endurance were both necessary and dangerous. The emotional cost of navigating these dynamics became visible in fear, grief, and the relentless questioning of identity, purpose, and potential. By the time rehabilitation began, I understood that the fracture had redefined my relationship to the game. It was no longer solely about ambition, achievement, or proving oneself. The pursuit of professional football became intertwined with caution, recovery, and understanding the limits of the body. Childhood dreams remained a guiding force, but they were tempered by experience, vulnerability, and systemic awareness. The fracture had not destroyed the dream entirely, but it had reframed it, forcing a confrontation with risk, consequence, and the emotional cost of professional pursuit. The fractured spine was both a literal and symbolic rupture. It separated the idealized vision of success from the lived reality of consequence. Childhood goals, once unchallenged and expansive, now demanded negotiation with anatomy, culture, and circumstance. The broken dream was not simply about lost opportunity. It was about the recalibration of identity, ambition, and expectation. The emotional labor required to navigate this fracture, both physical and psychological, became the defining challenge of my rookie season. The first time I was wheeled into the operating room, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the cold hum of machinery reminded me that recovery would demand more than just patience. The fracture that had haunted my rookie season required surgical intervention. A precise orchestration of steel, screws, and human skill designed to stabilize a spine that had already been tested beyond its limits. The procedure itself was clinical, methodical, and efficient. Surgeons worked with a quiet intensity, aware that each movement carried consequences that could extend far beyond the operating table. My consciousness floated somewhere between awareness and sedation, and even in those moments, the weight of the season, the hidden games, and the months of denial pressed heavily on me. Recovery began immediately, though the process was neither linear nor simple. The first days after surgery were dominated by pain that was both familiar and entirely new. The familiar ache of the fracture was replaced by a sharper, more controlled discomfort, a consequence of intervention and the body's natural response to trauma. Movement was limited, monitored, and prescribed. I learned to navigate the smallest actions, sitting up, turning, breathing each, a negotiation between will and limitation. The physical challenge was clear, tangible, and exacting. But the emotional dimension of recovery proved equally, if not more, formidable. Frustration became a constant companion. My body, once a vehicle of achievement and endurance, was now unpredictable, fragile, and demanding of careful attention. Every step, every attempt at normal motion reminded me that the past months of concealment had created consequences that could not be erased. Rehabilitation exercises, repeated and meticulous, were designed not just to strengthen the spine, but to retrain the nervous system, recalibrate muscles, and restore balance. Progress was incremental, measured in millimeters of mobility, degrees of flexibility, and incremental gains that required intense focus and relentless effort. Emotional scars revealed themselves in ways that the surgical intervention could not address. The trauma of concealment, of risking permanent injury for the sake of survival, weighed on the mind as heavily as the fracture weighed on the body. I wrestled with feelings of anger toward myself, guilt for the choices I had made, and anxiety about whether recovery would allow me to return to the field. Nights were restless, haunted by memory and anticipation, by flashes of collisions and the knowledge of what might have occurred if the fracture had worsened. Recovery demanded more than physical labor. It required emotional resilience, a reevaluation of identity, and an acknowledgement of vulnerability that had previously been suppressed. Physical therapy sessions became the focal point of daily life. Therapists guided each movement with precision, emphasizing posture, alignment, and controlled progression. Exercises that had once been routine became exercises in mindfulness and discipline, requiring concentration and patience. I learned to negotiate pain in a new way, to distinguish between discomfort that signaled growth and danger, and to trust a body that had been unreliable in its silence. Each day presented a mix of hope and caution, victories small and incremental, and setbacks that reminded me of the delicate balance inherent in spinal recovery. Support systems previously taken for granted became essential. Family, friends, and select teammates provided emotional reinforcement, encouragement, and accountability. Conversations with medical professionals illuminated the gravity of my choices and the importance of adherence to prescribed protocols. The fracture, once a hidden secret, now occupied every discussion, every consideration, and every plan. I realized that recovery was not solitary. It was an interconnected process, a negotiation between body, mind, and community, each element essential to progress. The psychological burden of the injury persisted even as physical healing progressed. Fear remained a constant companion, not of immediate collapse, but of setbacks, complications, and the possibility that rehabilitation might fail to restore function fully. Anxiety was magnified by the awareness that time was finite, that opportunities in the league were fleeting, and that each day of recovery represented a period of uncertainty in an environment where performance is paramount. The emotional landscape was as rigorous as the physical, demanding reflection, resilience, and constant mental engagement. Months of rehabilitation revealed the slow, exacting nature of recovery. Early progress gave way to plateaus, moments when strength and mobility seemed stagnant. Frustration surfaced as therapy sessions extended in duration and complexity. I began to understand that the body's response to trauma is neither immediate nor predictable. Healing requires adherence, patience, and the acknowledgement that recovery is measured in incremental improvements rather than dramatic leaps. Each milestone achieved became both a relief and a reminder of vulnerability, a duality that shaped emotional response and outlook. Interactions with medical staff highlighted the intersection of expertise, empathy, and accountability. Doctors monitored progress, adjusted regimens, and reinforced the importance of compliance. Therapists provided encouragement, measured feedback, and practical strategies to manage discomfort and optimize recovery. Their presence was grounding, yet it also reinforced the fragility of the situation. Healing was not merely a matter of desire. It was a complex, controlled process requiring respect for limits and recognition of the systemic pressures that had contributed to the initial injury. The fracture had altered not just physical capability, but identity. The rookie who had once prided himself on endurance and toughness now confronted limitations. That challenged self-perception. Emotional adaptation became as critical as physical rehabilitation. Patience, acceptance, and reflection were necessary to navigate the daily realities of recovery. The emotional labor was ongoing, requiring reconciliation with risk, reassessment of ambition, and negotiation with vulnerability that had previously been denied. The fracture was no longer a hidden secret. It was a defining feature of both present and future experience. Within this framework, small victories carried profound significance. The ability to bend without pain, to walk without hesitation, to participate in controlled drills was celebrated. Each milestone, while modest in isolation, represented the accumulation of effort, resilience, and adaptation. Progress was tangible, yet always shadowed by the knowledge of what had been risked and the fragility that remained. Recovery was both a personal triumph and a continual reminder of vulnerability, illustrating the complex interplay of determination, skill, and circumstance. Reflection became an essential part of the rehabilitation process. I considered how concealment, culture, and systemic pressures had converged to place me in harm's way. I analyzed decisions made during training camp, games, and workouts, understanding that risk had been compounded by a system that both rewarded endurance and discouraged disclosure. Emotional scars were the residue of that reality, as enduring as the physical limitations imposed by the fracture itself. Healing required not just therapy, but reflection, critical understanding, and emotional processing. Ultimately, the recovery process underscored the duality of consequence. Physical healing progressed according to medical protocol, yet emotional recovery remained ongoing. The fracture had revealed both the limits of the body and the weight of choices made under pressure. Patience, persistence, and self-awareness became guiding principles. Recovery was no longer defined solely by mobility or strength, but by the capacity to integrate experience, manage fear, and reconcile ambition with vulnerability. The journey illuminated the broader truth that in professional football, the cost of progress is measured in both physical and emotional currency. Months after surgery, the cumulative impact of rehabilitation became evident. Physical milestones were achieved, yet the emotional landscape remained layered, complex, and ongoing. The rookie who had hidden the fracture now navigated recovery with awareness, caution, and reflection. The injury had imposed limits, yet it had also offered clarity about priorities, vulnerability, and the systemic pressures inherent in professional sport. Healing required more than time. It demanded sustained engagement with body, mind, and identity. A recognition that recovery is as much about resilience as it is about physical restoration. The first time I was wheeled into the operating room, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the cold hum of machinery reminded me that recovery would demand more than just patience. The fracture that had haunted my rookie season required surgical intervention. A precise orchestration of steel, screws, and human skill designed to stabilize a spine that had already been tested beyond its limits. The procedure itself was clinical, methodical, and efficient. Surgeons worked with a quiet intensity, aware that each movement carried consequences that could extend far beyond the operating table. My consciousness floated somewhere between awareness and sedation, and even in those moments, the weight of the season, the hidden games, and the months of denial pressed heavily on me. Recovery began immediately, though the process was neither linear nor simple. The first days after surgery were dominated by pain that was both familiar and entirely new. The familiar ache of the fracture was replaced by a sharper, more controlled discomfort, a consequence of intervention and the body's natural response to trauma. Movement was limited, monitored, and prescribed. I learned to navigate the smallest actions, sitting up, turning, breathing each, a negotiation between will and limitation. The physical challenge was clear, tangible, and exacting. But the emotional dimension of recovery proved equally, if not more, formidable. Frustration became a constant companion. My body, once a vehicle of achievement and endurance, was now unpredictable, fragile, and demanding of careful attention. Every step, every attempt at normal motion reminded me that the past months of concealment had created consequences that could not be erased. Rehabilitation exercises, repeated and meticulous, were designed not just to strengthen the spine, but to retrain the nervous system, recalibrate muscles, and restore balance. Progress was incremental, measured in millimeters of mobility, degrees of flexibility, and incremental gains that required intense focus and relentless effort. Emotional scars revealed themselves in ways that the surgical intervention could not address. The trauma of concealment, of risking permanent injury for the sake of survival, weighed on the mind as heavily as the fracture weighed on the body. I wrestled with feelings of anger toward myself, guilt for the choices I had made, and anxiety about whether recovery would allow me to return to the field. Nights were restless, haunted by memory and anticipation, by flashes of collisions and the knowledge of what might have occurred if the fracture had worsened. Recovery demanded more than physical labor. It required emotional resilience, a reevaluation of identity, and an acknowledgement of vulnerability that had previously been suppressed. Physical therapy sessions became the focal point of daily life. Therapists guided each movement with precision, emphasizing posture, alignment, and controlled progression. Exercises that had once been routine became exercises in mindfulness and discipline, requiring concentration and patience. I learned to negotiate pain in a new way, to distinguish between discomfort that signaled growth and danger, and to trust a body that had been unreliable in its silence. Each day presented a mix of hope and caution, victories small and incremental, and setbacks that reminded me of the delicate balance inherent in spinal recovery. Support systems previously taken for granted became essential. Family, friends, and select teammates provided emotional reinforcement, encouragement, and accountability. Conversations with medical professionals illuminated the gravity of my choices and the importance of adherence to prescribed protocols. The fracture, once a hidden secret, now occupied every discussion, every consideration, and every plan. I realized that recovery was not solitary. It was an interconnected process, a negotiation between body, mind, and community, each element essential to progress. The psychological burden of the injury persisted even as physical healing progressed. Fear remained a constant companion, not of immediate collapse, but of setbacks, complications, and the possibility that rehabilitation might fail to restore function fully. Anxiety was magnified by the awareness that time was finite, that opportunities in the league were fleeting, and that each day of recovery represented a period of uncertainty in an environment where performance is paramount. The emotional landscape was as rigorous as the physical, demanding reflection, resilience, and constant mental engagement. Months of rehabilitation revealed the slow, exacting nature of recovery. Early progress gave way to plateaus, moments when strength and mobility seemed stagnant. Frustration surfaced as therapy sessions extended in duration and complexity. I began to understand that the body's response to trauma is neither immediate nor predictable. Healing requires adherence, patience, and the acknowledgement that recovery is measured in incremental improvements rather than dramatic leaps. Each milestone achieved became both a relief and a reminder of vulnerability, a duality that shaped emotional response and outlook. Interactions with medical staff highlighted the intersection of expertise, empathy, and accountability. Doctors monitored progress, adjusted regimens, and reinforced the importance of compliance. Therapists provided encouragement, measured feedback, and practical strategies to manage discomfort and optimize recovery. Their presence was grounding, yet it also reinforced the fragility of the situation. Healing was not merely a matter of desire. It was a complex, controlled process requiring respect for limits and recognition of the systemic pressures that had contributed to the initial injury. The fracture had altered not just physical capability, but identity. The rookie who had once prided himself on endurance and toughness now confronted limitations. That challenged self-perception. Emotional adaptation became as critical as physical rehabilitation. Patience, acceptance, and reflection were necessary to navigate the daily realities of recovery. The emotional labor was ongoing, requiring reconciliation with risk, reassessment of ambition, and negotiation with vulnerability that had previously been denied. The fracture was no longer a hidden secret. It was a defining feature of both present and future experience. Within this framework, small victories carried profound significance. The ability to bend without pain, to walk without hesitation, to participate in controlled drills was celebrated. Each milestone, while modest in isolation, represented the accumulation of effort, resilience, and adaptation. Progress was tangible, yet always shadowed by the knowledge of what had been risked and the fragility that remained. Recovery was both a personal triumph and a continual reminder of vulnerability, illustrating the complex interplay of determination, skill, and circumstance. Reflection became an essential part of the rehabilitation process. I considered how concealment, culture, and systemic pressures had converged to place me in harm's way. I analyzed decisions made during training camp, games, and workouts. Understanding that risk had been compounded by a system that both rewarded endurance and discouraged disclosure. Emotional scars were the residue of that reality, as enduring as the physical limitations imposed by the fracture itself. Healing required not just therapy, but reflection, critical understanding, and emotional processing. Ultimately, the recovery process underscored the duality of consequence. Physical healing progressed according to medical protocol, yet emotional recovery remained ongoing. The fracture had revealed both the limits of the body and the weight of choices made under pressure. Patience, persistence, and self-awareness became guiding principles. Recovery was no longer defined solely by mobility or strength, but by the capacity to integrate experience, manage fear, and reconcile ambition with vulnerability. The journey illuminated the broader truth that in professional football, the cost of progress is measured in both physical and emotional currency. Months after surgery, the cumulative impact of rehabilitation became evident. Physical milestones were achieved, yet the emotional landscape remained layered, complex, and ongoing. The rookie who had hidden the fracture now navigated recovery with awareness, caution, and reflection. The injury had imposed limits, yet it had also offered clarity about priorities, vulnerability, and the systemic pressures inherent in professional sport. Healing required more than time. It demanded sustained engagement with body, mind, and identity. A recognition that recovery is as much about resilience as it is about physical restoration. Pain has always been an intrinsic element of professional football, yet few injuries carry the existential weight of those affecting the spine. For decades, the league has witnessed players endure fractures, herniated discs, and debilitating vertebral injuries, often with minimal intervention beyond temporary pain management. The history of spinal trauma in football reads as a catalog of courage, endurance, and institutional oversight, revealing both the physical cost of the sport and the systemic factors that allow athletes to risk permanent harm. One of the earliest recorded instances of a severe spinal injury occurred in the late 1970s, when a promising linebacker sustained a cervical fracture during a preseason game. He continued to play through pain, driven by contractual obligation, peer pressure, and the prevailing culture of toughness. Ultimately, the injury ended his career prematurely, leaving him with chronic pain and limited mobility. Doctors who treated him later described the league's response at the time as reactive rather than preventive. The priority was roster maintenance, competitive balance, and public perception. Player welfare was secondary. This case, among others, set a precedent. The league had long been aware of spinal injuries, yet lacked a consistent, standardized approach to prevention, disclosure, and treatment. In the 1990s, spinal injuries became more visible as sports medicine advanced and media coverage increased. One high-profile case involved a running back whose vertebrae were severely compromised after repeated collisions. He initially hid the injury, fearing release from his team and the loss of endorsement opportunities. When the truth emerged, the league imposed a medical suspension, emphasizing short-term rest and limited rehabilitation. Yet the incident highlighted a persistent pattern. The league's public statements emphasized concern and compliance, while internal protocols often relied on the discretion of team doctors and coaches. Players were left to navigate a minefield where disclosure could jeopardize their careers, yet silence carried catastrophic risk. Rookies entering the league inherit this culture of endurance. They are informed of physical hazards during orientation, yet the implicit message is clear. Toughness is currency, and vulnerability is weakness. The fracture that defined my rookie season is not an anomaly. It is part of a continuum of spinal injuries that have tested both individual resilience and institutional response. The league knows the stakes, understands the mechanisms of injury, and observes patterns of concealment and risk. Yet systemic changes are slow and reactive rather than proactive. The incentive structures embedded in contracts, insurance, and team evaluation perpetuate a cycle in which pain is normalized, endurance is valorized, and disclosure is discouraged. Medical literature has long documented the consequences of spinal trauma in football. Cervical fractures, herniated discs, and chronic vertebral compression can result in lifelong pain, neurological deficits, and paralysis. Players often experience a delayed onset of symptoms, making initial detection difficult. Teams historically relied on periodic physical examinations and subjective reporting, leaving gaps in surveillance and early intervention. Case studies demonstrate that athletes who concealed injuries frequently endured cumulative trauma, leading to compounded damage that might have been mitigated with earlier recognition. The league has funded research, yet practical implementation of preventative protocols has lagged behind knowledge. Several mid-career players illustrate the dangers of systemic neglect. A defensive lineman in the early 2000s concealed a minor cervical injury to participate in playoffs. The cumulative impact of repeated collisions ultimately required surgical intervention and forced early retirement. Similarly, a tight end who attempted to mask persistent lower back fractures experienced neurological symptoms that necessitated extensive rehabilitation. In both instances, the league had records of prior injuries and documented medical reports, yet immediate enforcement of safety protocols was inconsistent. The broader lesson was that awareness existed, but risk mitigation relied heavily on player honesty, variable complicated by the culture of toughness and fear of career jeopardy. Insurance and contractual frameworks further reinforce this environment. Non-guaranteed contracts incentivize concealment, as absence due to injury can lead to release or loss of signing bonuses. The league has recognized this structural pressure, yet reforms are often incremental and inconsistent. Policies mandate injury reporting and require baseline medical evaluations, yet enforcement is uneven, leaving rookies and vulnerable players to navigate the consequences alone. This framework creates a paradox. Athletes are expected to self-disclose while simultaneously fearing reprisal, creating a systemic culture in which spinal injuries can be concealed, normalized, and exacerbated. Public discourse about spinal injuries has intensified as former players have shared personal experiences. Retirees describe chronic pain, limited mobility, and psychological strain stemming from unreported or concealed injuries. One former offensive lineman reflected that pain became part of my identity. I didn't want to be the weak link, so I pushed through until my body told me I couldn't anymore. Testimonies like this reveal a pattern in which endurance is culturally valorized, yet the costs are substantial and lifelong. The league has acknowledged these narratives in press statements and research initiatives, yet systemic reform remains slow, constrained by competitive pressures, financial interests, and cultural inertia. The NFL Players Association has advocated for enhanced medical oversight, standardized reporting, and comprehensive rehabilitation programs. Yet negotiations often involve compromise, balancing player safety with competitive integrity and financial realities. Injuries like the spinal fracture I endured highlight both the necessity and the limitations of union advocacy. Without cultural change within teams, transparency and compliance may exist in policy, but remain underutilized in practice. For rookies especially, the tension between ambition and vulnerability continues to define experience, compelling difficult choices in pursuit of career longevity. Historical patterns underscore the recurring nature of these challenges. Spinal injuries have been part of the league's fabric for decades, yet visibility does not always translate into systemic change. The combination of individual ambition, structural pressures, and cultural norms has perpetuated cycles in which concealment is rationalized, endurance is rewarded, and disclosure is punished. My experience as a rookie represents a contemporary iteration of these dynamics. The fracture was both personal and emblematic, a microcosm of the intersection between physical risk, organizational structure, and cultural expectation. The broader implications of this history are stark. Awareness of spinal injury risks is widespread, documented in research, medical reports, and player narratives. Case studies demonstrate repeated patterns of concealment and escalation, illustrating the high stakes of silence. Yet the institutional response, while present in policies, often reactive, is contingent on visibility and immediate danger, rather than proactive, preventive, or fully enforced. The league's knowledge of pain is therefore both explicit and insufficiently operationalized, leaving athletes to navigate the terrain between endurance and jeopardy largely on their own. Reflection on this reality reshapes understanding of the rookie experience. Entering the league with ambition and physical promise entails immediate exposure to risk, cultural expectation, and systemic pressures. Pain is normalized, reporting is discouraged, and endurance becomes both a measure of toughness and a vehicle for potential harm. Spinal injuries, with their unique potential for permanent consequences, serve as a lens through which the complexities of professional football culture, medical oversight, and organizational priorities are revealed. Knowledge exists, yet risk persists. In my own recovery, awareness of this history provided context but little consolation. I realized that my fracture was not an anomaly, but a continuation of a pattern. A predictable intersection of personal ambition, cultural expectation, and systemic oversight. The lessons embedded in the league's historical approach to spinal injury awareness without consistent enforcement. Knowledge without immediate intervention were mirrored in my own experience, shaping both the severity of consequences and the trajectory of rehabilitation. The path forward required negotiating not only physical healing, but a broader understanding of the forces that shape risk, concealment, and survival in the NFL. By examining the league's knowledge of spinal injury, it becomes evident that the story of a rookie who played on a broken spine is simultaneously personal and systemic. Individual ambition collides with organizational logic, cultural norms, and structural pressures. The fracture represents both the immediate danger of physical trauma and the broader dynamics of an environment in which endurance is valorized, risk is normalized, and disclosure is fraught with consequence. Understanding this history is essential to understanding why injuries are concealed, why recovery is complex, and why the psychological toll is as profound as the physical. From the moment a rookie steps onto an NFL field, the stakes are defined not only by performance, but by survival. Each practice, each drill, each preseason game carries implicit expectations. The culture of toughness, coupled with contractual and economic pressures, creates an environment in which playing hurt is not merely encouraged, is expected. This hidden epidemic of rookies concealing injuries has persisted for decades, leaving countless young athletes vulnerable to long-term physical and psychological consequences. Historically, the rookie experience has always been precarious. A first-year player is acutely aware of non-guaranteed contracts, limited roster spots, and the constant threat of replacement. Every missed snap, every faltered block, and every hint of weakness can jeopardize the trajectory of a career that took a lifetime to build. Within this environment, pain becomes currency, endurance a signal of value, and silence a survival strategy. Trainers, coaches, and teammates often see only the surface, leaving rookies to navigate injuries in secrecy, negotiating between immediate necessity and long-term consequence. Economic pressures are a defining element of this pattern. Rookie contracts, particularly for lower drafted players, are almost entirely contingent on performance and availability. Missing a single game due to injury can mean lost bonuses, delayed contract escalation, or the risk of being cut altogether. The financial stakes intersect with personal ambition, creating a moral and physical dilemma. Reveal an injury and risk career jeopardy, or conceal it and risk permanent damage. This dynamic has shaped decisions for generations of players, fostering a culture in which hiding pain is rationalized, even normalized. Cultural factors reinforce this phenomenon. Legendary narratives of toughness players who returned from severe injuries to dominate on the field have perpetuated an ethos in which vulnerability is equated with weakness. Veteran players often share stories of hidden fractures, strained ligaments, and herniated discs, framing endurance as a rite of passage. Rookies absorb these lessons through observation, imitation, and explicit advice, internalizing the idea that to survive in the league, one must endure, conceal, and persist. The message is subtle yet powerful. The body is expendable, reputation is fragile, and ambition must transcend pain. Journalists who have chronicled the league's culture of injury often describe this phenomenon as endemic. One sports reporter who covered multiple seasons reflected that rookies are under constant scrutiny. They're told to play through pain, to earn respect, to show they belong. It's not malicious, it's systemic. The pressure is invisible until it becomes physical. Investigations and retrospective interviews reveal a recurring pattern. Young players conceal injuries ranging from sprained ankles to cracked vertebrae, motivated by the intersection of personal ambition, economic necessity, and cultural expectation. Trainers have long witnessed this behavior firsthand. Medical staff are trained to evaluate, treat, and advise, yet they are often constrained by the league's policies, coaching directives, and player behavior. One veteran trainer described rookies as masters of concealment. They will tell you they're fine, push through drills, and hide symptoms until the body gives an unmistakable warning. These warnings, when they come, can range from acute pain to sudden collapse. The tension between professional obligation and personal safety is constant, and trainers are frequently caught in a system that values results over disclosure. A deeper analysis reveals that the hidden epidemic is not limited to one team, one era, or one demographic. It spans decades, geographic regions, and levels of draft placement. From the earliest professional leagues to the modern NFL, rookies have faced similar pressures to endure, to conceal, and to perform despite injury. The cumulative effect is staggering. Players often carry injuries into subsequent seasons, exacerbating damage and prolonging recovery. In some cases, the consequences are lifelong, affecting mobility, neurological function, and quality of life. The epidemic is hidden not because it is rare, but because it is normalized, woven into the fabric of professional football culture. The psychological component of playing hurt cannot be overstated. Young athletes internalize the notion that pain is both a test of character and a marker of legitimacy. Enduring injury becomes a source of pride, while disclosure is associated with weakness or failure. This mindset is reinforced through peer dynamics, coaching narratives, and media coverage. The psychological cost is cumulative. Anxiety, fear, and stress accompany every play, compounding the physical toll. For rookies navigating this environment, the decision to hide injury is both conscious and culturally conditioned, a survival mechanism that carries profound long-term consequences. Case studies highlight the widespread nature of the epidemic. One rookie linebacker in the late 1980s concealed a herniated disc to avoid missing training camp, later requiring extensive spinal surgery and forced early retirement. Another defensive back in the early 2000s attempted to mask ligament tears with painkillers, ultimately suffering permanent mobility limitations. Each instance illustrates a pattern. Young athletes, aware of the personal and professional stakes, make calculated decisions to conceal injuries, often under the guidance explicit or implicit of the broader system in which they operate. Media coverage has begun to illuminate these hidden stories, but institutional responses remain limited. The league has invested in research, wellness programs, and medical protocols, yet enforcement is inconsistent and cultural norms persist. Public narratives celebrate comebacks and heroic endurance while often overlooking the quiet sacrifices and concealed injuries that underpin performance. The hidden epidemic thrives in this duality. Transparency is rewarded rhetorically, yet concealment is rationalized behaviorally. Ultimately, the prevalence of rookies playing hurt underscores a structural reality of professional football. Ambition, economic pressure, and culture converge to create conditions in which young athletes routinely place themselves at risk. The rookie who played on a broken spine is emblematic of this broader phenomenon, his experience reflecting systemic patterns that extend far beyond a single team, season, or injury. Understanding this epidemic requires both acknowledgement of personal decision-making and scrutiny of the structural forces that shape those decisions. The emotional cost is substantial. Young players navigate fear, ambition, and identity simultaneously, making choices that carry immediate benefit but long-term consequence. The hidden epidemic is not merely a medical issue. It is a cultural, economic, and psychological challenge embedded within the league. Recognizing the systemic nature of these pressures is essential to understanding the rookie experience and the risks inherent in professional football. As the narrative of this rookie unfolds, it becomes clear that his fracture was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern, a microcosm of a hidden epidemic that has persisted across decades. The convergence of culture, economy, and expectation created a situation in which concealment was rational, endurance celebrated, and long-term consequence inevitable. Understanding this hidden epidemic is crucial to grasping the forces that shape injury, recovery, and the identity of rookies entering the league. The human spine is a marvel of engineering, a structure of extraordinary resilience and delicate vulnerability. In the moments during my rookie season when the fracture revealed itself fully, I became intimately aware of the thin line separating endurance from catastrophe. Every snap, every collision, every step I took while concealing the injury was a negotiation with fate, a silent gamble in which the stakes were life-altering. Medical analysis later revealed the precariousness of that season, the ways in which a single miscalculated hit could have resulted in paralysis, permanent disability, or worse. Understanding the proximity to tragedy reframes every memory, every choice, and every risk taken in the pursuit of professional football. The fracture itself involved the lumbar region, a site where stability is critical for movement, support, and protection of neural pathways. According to my surgical team, the microfractures and compromised vertebrae were one catastrophic collision away from severe spinal cord damage. Reflection on luck is unavoidable. There were moments when the fracture nearly manifested in sudden, debilitating symptoms. One late-game play involved a tackle in which my body twisted in an unpredictable way. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through my lower back and legs. For a moment, my legs failed to respond with normal coordination. Adrenaline allowed me to remain upright, to move to the sideline, and to conceal the extent of the damage from those around me. Had this occurred milliseconds differently, The result might have been catastrophic. The line between injury and tragedy was thinner than I had ever imagined. Luck, circumstance, and timing became critical factors in survival, intertwined with physical resilience and human decision-making. Medical consultations following surgery illuminated the magnitude of risk I had faced. Imaging revealed microfractures that had stabilized only because of the fortuitous alignment of spinal structures and the protective tension of surrounding musculature. Neurologists emphasized the rarity of surviving such an injury without permanent damage. They described the scenario as extremely higher risk, highlighting the delicate interplay between chance and physiology. Each day of concealment, each snap of play was a calculated risk, with outcomes ranging from continued performance to irreversible impairment. Understanding the precariousness reframed not only my experience, but also my perception of the league, the culture, and the systemic pressures that had contributed to this situation. Beyond the medical specifics, there is the emotional gravity of survival. Enduring a season while concealed injury demanded constant vigilance, acute awareness, and a psychological fortitude that is both necessary and dangerous. The fear of catastrophic injury existed beneath every play, silently shaping behavior and decision-making. I was acutely aware that a moment of misjudgment, a slight misalignment, or an unforeseen collision could end not just my career, but my mobility. This awareness imbued every action with tension, creating a psychological landscape in which the thrill of playing was inseparable from the risk of tragedy. Reflection on fate and circumstance also intersects with cultural expectation. The rookie culture, the imperative to prove oneself, and the financial and social stakes collectively created a pressure cooker environment. Decisions made in this context were not purely personal. They were conditioned by systemic factors. The awareness that a single hit could change everything compounded the tension, emphasizing the narrow margin for error and the high stakes inherent in every choice to play through pain. Rookies, like me, navigate this terrain with incomplete information, guided by ambition, mentorship, and observation, yet often unaware of the full scope of risk until after the fact. The role of preparation and instinct cannot be understated. Training, conditioning, and repeated rehearsal of plays offered a measure of protection, allowing the body to respond reflexively to impacts and maneuvers. Yet instinct and skill can only compensate to a point. Spinal injuries are unforgiving, and the fracture exposed the limits of what preparation could achieve. In retrospect, I recognized that luck had intersected with training to preserve function. Comparisons to historical cases further contextualize the thin line between injury and tragedy. These cases illustrate that the risk I faced was neither hypothetical nor isolated. The league, teams, and players have long been aware that spinal injuries carry profound implications. Yet cultural, economic, and structural pressures frequently encourage concealment. The statistical reality is stark. Spinal fractures are rare but devastating, and outcomes hinge on minute differences in timing, alignment, and intervention. The difference between recovery and catastrophe is often a matter of millimeters and seconds. Awareness of near catastrophe alters perception of performance, identity, and self-worth. Endurance becomes intertwined with vulnerability, and each success is shadowed by the potential for permanent loss. I grappled with questions that extend beyond football: the role of fate in human endeavor, the limits of physical control, survival in this context. Neither purely physical nor purely psychologically, is a convergence of circumstance, decision-making, and resilience under extreme pressure. In considering what could have happened, reflection extends to broader implications for player safety. The thin line between injury and tragedy highlights systemic vulnerabilities. Policies, medical oversight, and cultural norms intersect in ways that place rookies and vulnerable players in high-stakes situations. Understanding these dynamics is essential to evaluating not just individual outcomes, but the responsibilities of organizations, trainers, and the league itself. The combination of knowledge and inertia creates conditions in which catastrophe remains a constant possibility, underscoring the ethical and practical complexities of professional football. Ultimately, the rookie who played on a broken spine represents both individual endurance and systemic vulnerability. Medical analysis illuminates the tangible dangers, while reflection on luck, fate, and survival emphasizes the human dimension of risk. Each play, each choice, each concealment was a negotiation with forces both internal and external, highlighting the precarious balance between aspiration and consequence. The thin line between injury and tragedy is real. And walking it requires not only physical resilience, but awareness, reflection, and a confrontation with the limits of control. As I navigated that season, the fracture became more than a physical reality, became a lens through which to understand risk, vulnerability, and survival in professional football. The proximity to paralysis reframed every decision, every action, and every moment of endurance. The medical analysis confirmed what instinct had always whispered, that I had survived by a margin so narrow it is almost incomprehensible. Fate, preparation, and resilience converged in a season that could have ended permanently on a single snap. The moment I accepted that my professional football career had ended was a collision far more devastating than any I had experienced on the field. Unlike a tackle or a crushing block, this realization came without warning, without physical pain, yet it struck deeper than any vertebral fracture could. Life after the league demanded an entirely different kind of endurance, one that involved confronting identity, ambition, and purpose in ways I had never anticipated. For a young man who had devoted every ounce of energy, ambition, and personal narrative to football, the absence of the game felt like a vacuum, a loss of self that could not be remedied by rehabilitation alone. The first weeks were defined by disorientation and denial. I moved through daily life mechanically, as if waiting for a call, a practice, or a team meeting that would never come. The routines that had structured existence, the early mornings, the drills, the meetings, the locker room camaraderie were gone. In their place were silence, free hours, and the pressing awareness that the trajectory of my life had shifted irrevocably. Sleep was fractured, nightmares a constant reminder of collisions and consequences. The body, once trained to endure pain and respond instinctively, now carried not only lingering physical limitations, but a profound emotional weight. Each step reminded me that I was no longer the athlete I had been, and each day required a recalibration of expectation, ambition, and identity. Rebuilding identity outside the league involved confronting the psychological aftermath of ambition deferred and dreams deferred. Football had not just been a profession. It had been a defining narrative, a lens through which I understood value, resilience, and belonging. Stripped of that framework, I was forced to navigate unfamiliar terrain, balancing the achievements of a brief career with the reality of what had been lost. I wrestled with questions of self-worth. Who was I without the jersey, the field, and the applause? Could resilience be translated from athletic prowess to life beyond football? These questions were not abstract. They were urgent, demanding attention and introspection with every waking hour. Physical recovery remained a critical component of post-football life. Although the fracture had healed, lingering weakness, stiffness, and occasional nerve pain served as daily reminders of vulnerability. Activities that had once been effortless, running, bending, lifting, required caution, adaptation, and patience. The rehabilitation process continued long after the operating room. Physical therapy sessions, extending into home routines, strength and flexibility regimens adapted to lifelong maintenance rather than performance. These exercises became symbolic, a way to reclaim agency over a body that had once been subjected to relentless risk, and a method of redefining endurance in the absence of professional demands. Psychological adaptation proved more challenging. The identity crisis was compounded by isolation from the social networks that had been integral to daily life. Teammates, coaches, and staff had been central to both personal and professional development, their absence leaving a vacuum of mentorship and camaraderie. I sought new communities, but the intensity, shared purpose, and immediate feedback of football were irreplaceable. Social reintegration required patience, exploration of alternative interests, and the acknowledgement that fulfillment would not be derived from past identity, but from new forms of engagement and contribution. Career planning outside football demanded pragmatism and reflection. I explored opportunities in sports administration, coaching, and commentary, leveraging knowledge gained from years of experience while acknowledging limitations imposed by injury. Education became a priority, both formal and informal, as I sought to translate athletic discipline into professional competency beyond the gridiron. These efforts required humility, adaptability, and a willingness to redefine success on terms other than physical dominance or competitive achievement. The process was gradual, demanding sustained effort, and fraught with emotional peaks and valleys, but ultimately it became a pathway toward purpose and agency. Emotional processing involved confronting the full spectrum of loss. There was grief for the body that had been compromised, for the career that had ended prematurely, and for the dreams that could not be realized. Anger, at times directed inward, and at times toward the system that had facilitated risk, was constant. Yet, intertwined with grief and anger was also a slow emergence of clarity, the recognition that survival was itself a form of triumph. That resilience could be measured beyond touchdowns and tackles, and that growth often emerges from adversity in ways that the field could never teach. Reflection, journaling, and therapy became essential tools in navigating this complex emotional landscape. One of the most profound realizations involved the reframing of pain and endurance. For years, toughness had been defined by concealment, risk, and endurance under pressure. After football, I learned that resilience could be redefined through honesty, adaptation, and strategic action. Recognizing limitations, seeking support, and investing in personal development became new markers of strength. Pain remained a teacher, but now its lessons extended beyond the field, encompassing emotional intelligence, practical problem-solving, and the pursuit of sustainable well-being. Family and personal relationships assumed central importance. The intensity and time demands of professional football had previously limited the depth of connection outside the team. These connections provided both grounding and motivation, reinforcing the notion that identity extends beyond performance metrics, statistics, or public perception. Ultimately, life after the league involved integrating experience, loss, and recovery into a coherent narrative of identity and purpose. The rookie who once played on a broken spine had survived, physically and psychologically, but the journey demanded adaptation, reflection, and courage. The story of transition is not linear. It is punctuated by moments of doubt, reflection, and growth. Yet within this narrative lies a powerful truth. Endurance and resilience are not confined to the field. They extend into life beyond football, manifesting in recovery, personal development, and the reconstruction of meaning after ambition is interrupted. By the time I began to engage with post-football endeavors fully, a sense of balance emerged. Physical health stabilized, emotional resilience strengthened, and a new understanding of purpose took shape. Lessons from the field discipline, focus, accountability found translation into professional and personal spheres. Yet the memory of the fracture, of the thin line between injury and catastrophe, and of the hidden pressures that shaped my rookie season remained. It served as a constant reminder that survival carries responsibility. Responsibility to oneself, to others, and to the broader system that governs the sport. Reflection on life after the league also underscores the broader narrative of athlete experience. Many players confront similar challenges: identity disruption, physical limitations, and psychological strain. But the path forward is shaped by awareness, adaptability, and engagement with personal growth. The hidden struggles previously concealed under the guise of toughness and ambition become central to understanding the human cost of professional sport. Life after the league is not merely an endpoint. 'Tis a continuation, a reframing, and an evolution of endurance in a context unbound by games, practices, or public expectation. Ultimately, surviving the rookie season, the fracture, and the hidden pressures of the NFL was only the beginning. Life after football demanded a reinvention of purpose, the reconstruction of identity, and the recognition that growth and resilience extend beyond the field. Physical recovery, emotional processing, and social reintegration combined to create a framework in which endurance, previously measured by performance and risk, could now be expressed through adaptation, reflection, and strategic engagement with life. The journey of rebuilding is continuous, demanding vigilance, patience, and courage. Yet it is also profoundly rewarding, illustrating the capacity for human resilience beyond the boundaries of professional sport. Years after the rookie season that had nearly destroyed me, the decision to tell the world about the fracture in my spine was both terrifying and liberating. The story had lived inside me for so long, a silent witness to endurance, fear, and near catastrophe. I had hidden it from teammates, coaches, and even family during the season, rationalizing that silence was necessary for survival. But in the years that followed, the weight of secrecy became unbearable. The decision to reveal the truth publicly was not motivated by a desire for attention or recognition. It was motivated by a need to reclaim ownership of my narrative, to ensure that the lessons of that hidden pain were not lost, and to shed light on the broader systemic forces that had shaped my choices. The first step was preparation. I meticulously recounted the events of that rookie year, the training camp collisions, the escalating pain, the microfractures that went undiagnosed, the games played on the edge of catastrophe, and the eventual diagnosis that stopped the locker room cold. I reflected on every sensation, every fear, and every moment of silence. Telling the story required confronting memories that I had worked to compartmentalize for years, the anxiety that followed each hit, the quiet dread of a snap that could have ended everything, and the psychological burden of enduring in isolation. Their reflections underscored a shared understanding. The pressures of professional football extend far beyond physical performance, shaping decisions with profound long-term consequences. Fans responded with a mixture of admiration, disbelief, and concern. Social media and sports forums lit up with commentary, ranging from questions about how such an injury could go unnoticed to expressions of gratitude for the transparency. Many younger fans, who idealized the toughness of the league, were forced to reconsider assumptions about heroism and endurance. The story prompted conversations about the hidden realities of professional football, the human costs behind the spectacle, and the complex interplay between ambition and vulnerability. For many, it was the first time the stakes of concealed injury were made tangible, personal, and profoundly human. Media coverage extended the conversation further, highlighting the systemic pressures that compel rookies to conceal injuries. Sports journalists examined patterns across decades, contextualizing my experience within a broader epidemic of young players playing hurt. Reports referenced historical cases, medical research, and interviews with trainers, emphasizing the combination of culture, economics, and expectation that fosters concealment. Coverage was largely respectful, though inevitably there were critical voices questioning whether disclosure undermined the image of toughness associated with the league. The dialogue, however, illuminated a critical truth. Transparency, even after the fact, is essential to understanding the hidden costs of professional football. Psychologically, telling the story was transformative. For years, the fracture had been a private burden, a source of shame, fear, and unresolved tension. Disclosure provided a release, allowing me to process the emotional and physical consequences of my rookie season in a public, constructive way. Speaking openly about fear, risk, and endurance reframed the experience, turning what had been a source of isolation into a platform for dialogue and advocacy. By naming the fracture, I reclaimed ownership of the narrative and connected my personal story to a larger conversation about player safety and organizational responsibility. The reactions from other players were particularly revealing. Many former athletes reached out privately, sharing similar experiences of hidden injuries and unspoken fear. One retired linebacker described hiding a herniated disc for an entire season, noting, "I thought I was alone." Hearing your story makes me realize this is bigger than one player, one team, one season. It's a system. These reflections highlighted a persistent tension within professional football, the culture of toughness, the economic pressures of rookie and non-guaranteed contracts, and the individual responsibility for health intersect in ways that create invisible crises. Disclosure, even years later, serves as both validation and cautionary tale. Media interviews also provided an opportunity to highlight systemic considerations. Discussions included the role of trainers, the limitations of preseason medical exams, and the responsibilities of the league to enforce safety protocols. Sports analysts examined patterns of concealment and risk, emphasizing how cultural expectation often outweighs institutional policy. By situating my story within a broader historical and structural context, these conversations underscored the recurring nature of the issue and its relevance to current players. The narrative shifted from personal anecdote to societal concern, framing my experience as emblematic of hidden dynamics that continue to shape the league. Fan engagement reflected the complexity of public perception. Social media responses ranged from admiration for resilience to critique of the decision to play through injury, reflecting society's ambivalence toward endurance and risk. Some argued that playing hurt exemplified bravery, while others emphasized the preventable nature of the risks and the need for transparency. These conversations reinforce the multidimensional nature of the narrative. Personal courage and systemic oversight coexist with potential danger and long-term consequence. The dialogue created a space for reflection, debate, and awareness that extended far beyond the initial disclosure. Through telling the story, I also confronted my own unresolved emotions. Shame and pride were intertwined in complex ways. By articulating the experience, I transformed private trauma into a public lesson, illustrating the human cost of hidden injury, the pressures faced by rookies, and the thin line between endurance and catastrophe. Ultimately, revealing the fracture was an act of both accountability and empowerment. It held a mirror to the league, the culture, and the systemic pressures that enable hidden injury. It also provided a platform for other players to share experiences, seek guidance, and advocate for safety. The story underscored that while toughness and ambition are integral to professional football, transparency and self-preservation are equally critical. The narrative of playing on a broken spine is not merely a cautionary tale. It is a call to understand the broader dynamics of risk, endurance, and culture in the NFL. Telling the truth also allowed me to reclaim agency over the narrative. For years, the fracture had been a private, defining force, an unspoken testament to the risks of the game. By sharing it publicly, I reframed the experience as a source of insight, guidance, and advocacy. Players, fans, journalists, and medical professionals were invited to witness not only the physical consequences, but also the psychological, cultural, and systemic factors that shaped the season. Disclosure became a bridge between personal experience and collective awareness. As responses continued to arrive, the cumulative effect was profound. Players acknowledged the pressures they had faced. Fans gained a deeper appreciation for the hidden realities of the sport, and journalists documented patterns that had previously been invisible. The story of a rookie playing on a broken spine evolved from a private ordeal to a public conversation about risk, endurance, and systemic responsibility. The act of revealing the truth did not erase the trauma, but it transformed it into something constructive, shaping discourse and policy in ways that silence never could. In sharing the fracture, I confronted the past, acknowledged survival, and illuminated the hidden epidemic of injury concealment in professional football. The reactions of players, fans, and the media confirmed that the story resonated far beyond my own experience, touching on the broader realities of culture, economics, and personal choice within the league. It highlighted the enduring tension between ambition and vulnerability, risk and resilience, silence and disclosure. Through the act of telling, the narrative shifted from isolation to collective reflection, emphasizing the human dimension of professional sport and the importance of transparency. The story of the rookie who played on a broken spine is more than a personal account of endurance and risk. It is a prism through which the systemic realities of the NFL can be understood. A culture that prizes toughness above health, economic structures that incentivize concealment, medical protocols that are sometimes insufficient, and a pervasive silence that shapes decision-making from rookie orientation to veteran locker rooms. By examining these intersecting factors, it becomes possible to see the league not simply as a collection of games and statistics, but as a social and organizational ecosystem where ambition, risk, and consequence are tightly intertwined. At the core of the issue lies culture. Professional football has long celebrated resilience, pain tolerance, and the ability to perform under duress. Stories of players returning from torn ligaments, broken bones, and concussions are woven into the mythology of the sport. This ethos of toughness carries implicit expectations. If a player can endure, they earn respect. If they reveal vulnerability, they risk marginalization. For rookies, these expectations are immediate and uncompromising. They absorb the lessons of veteran behavior, locker room norms, and coaching directives, often before they fully understand the stakes of their own physical limitations. The rookie who concealed his fracture did so not only because of personal ambition, but because the culture around him reinforced the notion that survival required concealment. Economic structures further amplify this dynamic. The majority of rookie contracts are non-guaranteed, creating high stakes for availability and performance. Missing a single practice or game can have cascading financial and career consequences. Bonuses, contract escalations, and roster security are all tied to the perception of reliability and toughness. This structure implicitly discourages disclosure of injury, encouraging young athletes to weigh immediate opportunity against long-term risk. The result is a system in which rational decisions, from a financial and career perspective, often involve personal risk that would be unthinkable in other professions. The league's economic model thus intersects with culture to produce environments in which playing hurt is normalized and even incentivized. Medical protocols, while extensive in modern terms, are not infallible. Preseason evaluations, physicals, and ongoing monitoring are designed to identify risk and prevent catastrophic injury. Yet the system relies heavily on self-reporting, compliance, and the observation of trainers and coaches, creating gaps in detection. Microfractures, subtle misalignments, or injuries masked by conditioning and adrenaline can go unnoticed. In the case of the rookie, these gaps allowed a serious spinal injury to persist for weeks, imperceptible to staff and invisible to observers. While the league invests in medical research and wellness programs, the structural limitations of monitoring, combined with cultural and economic pressures, mean that some injuries will inevitably be concealed and exacerbated. Silence is the final element of this ecosystem. The unspoken expectation that players endure without disclosure is a powerful force shaping behavior. Silence is both a personal strategy and a cultural expectation, reinforcing a cycle that extends from rookie orientation through the entirety of a professional career. The rookie's decision to hide his injury was not an isolated ethical failing. It was an adaptive response to systemic pressures that reward endurance and concealment. The consequences of that silence, both for him and for others, highlight the human cost of institutionalized expectation. Taken together, culture, economics, medical protocols, and silence form an interlocking system that shapes decision-making, risk exposure, and career outcomes. The rookie's experience illustrates how these forces operate not as isolated factors, but as mutually reinforcing pressures. The stakes of concealment are immediate, tangible, and psychologically complex. The consequences of exposure are often invisible until they manifest in catastrophic injury, premature retirement, or long-term health complications. In this sense, his story is emblematic of a broader pattern, a structural reality that persists despite advances in medicine, awareness, and policy. The larger significance of this suffering extends beyond individual experience. It raises questions about responsibility, ethics, and oversight within the NFL. Who bears accountability when systemic pressures incentivize risk and concealment? How can policies, culture, and medical monitoring be realigned to prioritize player health without compromising competitive integrity? The story of the broken spine underscores that professional football is more than a game. It is a high-stakes arena in which human bodies are exposed to extraordinary physical risk, social pressures, and economic calculation. Understanding these dynamics is essential for evaluating both the morality and the operational structure of the league. The narrative also invites reflection on resilience, endurance, and identity. The rookie survived physically, but the costs of survival were both psychological and cultural. The league's culture shaped his decisions. His body paid the price. And the consequences extended far beyond immediate injury. These outcomes illuminate the tension between human aspiration and institutional expectation. It underscores that true courage is not merely enduring pain silently, but navigating risk with awareness, judgment, and integrity. The rookie season was defined by survival under extraordinary pressure, yet it also exposes the limitations of a culture that valorizes concealment. Courage, in this context, encompasses not only physical resilience, but also transparency, ethical reflection, and personal accountability. Understanding this distinction reframes both public perception and internal discourse about what it means to be a professional athlete in one of the most physically demanding sports on the planet. The lessons extend beyond football, offering insight into how institutions, culture, and human ambition intersect under extreme conditions. This is the story of one rookie, one injury, and one season that could have ended in permanent catastrophe. But it is also the story of the NFL itself, league defined by extraordinary achievement, profound risk, and systemic complexity. The culture, economics, medical protocols, and silence that shaped his choices remain operative today, affecting rookies and veterans alike. Understanding this story is essential for grasping the realities of professional football, the human cost behind performance, the hidden pressures that shape decisions, and the structural forces that determine who endures, who suffers, and who survives. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. The league is not merely a stage for spectacle, but a complex system in which human bodies, ambition, and institutional pressures intersect. The rookie who played on a broken spine reveals the stakes of endurance, the cost of silence, and the systemic forces that produce hidden suffering. His story demands reflection, accountability, and change, offering a lens through which to evaluate the ethical, medical, and cultural realities of the NFL. As I reflect on the journey of the rookie who played on a broken spine, the story unfolds not only as a personal ordeal, but as a prism through which the NFL, its culture, and its human cost can be understood. From the first hit in training camp to the public revelation of the fracture years later, this narrative is defined by endurance, ambition, and silence. It is the story of a young man who walked into a league that demanded more than skill, more than talent, more than even physical resilience, demanded the concealment of vulnerability, the suppression of pain, and the constant negotiation between risk and reward. In tracing this path, we uncover the realities of a system that exalts toughness while simultaneously exposing its participants to extraordinary, often unseen hazards. The rookie's experience highlights the intimate connection between identity and ambition. From childhood, football had been more than a game. It was a purpose, a defining element of self. Dreams of the NFL are woven into the fabric of upbringing for countless athletes. Long summer practices, relentless conditioning, and the singular focus on making it to the professional stage. The intensity of these dreams, combined with the economic stakes and social expectations of the league, creates a crucible in which physical and emotional endurance are tested simultaneously. For this rookie, the fracture in his spine was not only a medical event, but an existential one. It forced a confrontation with mortality, vulnerability, and the limits of personal control, even as ambition demanded perseverance. Sacrifice emerges as a defining theme. The rookie did not simply endure pain for glory. He endured it for survival within the system, for the validation of skill, and for the opportunity to remain part of a league that measures worth in snaps, tackles, and statistical achievement. Yet sacrifice is complicated when it is imposed by culture and reinforced by economic and institutional structures. The non-guaranteed contracts of rookies, the implicit expectation to conceal injuries, and the subtle pressures from coaches and teammates all intersect to make endurance both a personal and systemic obligation. In this context, the decision to hide a fracture is simultaneously an act of survival, a concession to culture, and a testament to human resilience. The cost of silence is another recurring theme. Throughout the rookie season, pain became identity, and endurance became a private language that separated him from teammates, coaches, and even himself. Silence is not merely absence of speech. It is an active form of labor, a mental and emotional burden that shapes decision-making and defines boundaries. In reflecting on this, it becomes clear that silence is both protective and destructive, a tool for survival that simultaneously exacts a profound cost. The human element behind the helmets is never abstract. Every collision, every snap, every game carries with it the physical and emotional labor of individuals who are deeply invested in their craft. The rookie's fractured spine is a stark reminder that behind the spectacle, the broadcasts, and the statistics are human beings negotiating pain, fear, and ambition. And vulnerabilities within the economic and organizational frameworks of the league. Medical staff, while skilled, operate within structural limitations. Culture, while inspiring in its celebration of toughness, can obscure risk and incentivize concealment. Economic pressures, while necessary in professional competition, can unintentionally compromise safety and judgment. Each of these dimensions interacts, producing conditions in which hidden injury is not merely likely, but, in some respects, predictable. By examining these intersections, it becomes possible to understand the broader structural context in which human endurance is both tested and exploited. Yet even within this analysis, there is admiration for the resilience and courage displayed. Endurance under extreme pressure, the capacity to perform despite fear and pain, and the mental fortitude required to navigate a season with a hidden spinal injury all reflect extraordinary human capability. These qualities deserve recognition, but they must be contextualized within the system that both demanded and enabled them. True insight arises not from glorifying suffering, but from understanding the conditions that produce it, the choices it necessitates, and the consequences it entails. The journey from rookie season to public disclosure demonstrates the potential for transformation and reflection. Confronting the past, speaking openly about concealed injury, and engaging with the broader implications of systemic pressure allows for both personal and communal learning. It reframes the narrative from one of silent suffering to one of insight, advocacy, and structural awareness. The lessons of survival, risk, and ambition are integrated into broader life trajectories, revealing the continuity of resilience beyond the confines of the gridiron. In this sense, the story is not only about what was lost, but also about what can be rebuilt, reimagined, and repurposed. Ultimately, the narrative of the rookie who played on a broken spine is a meditation on the human stakes of professional football. It reminds us that each statistic, each highlight, and each victory is inseparable from the physical and emotional labor of the players who make it possible. It calls attention to the systems, cultures, and structures that shape experience, incentivize concealment, and produce hidden suffering. And it emphasizes that understanding the NFL requires more than admiration for athletic skill. It requires acknowledgement of the human realities behind the spectacle, the ethical and medical complexities inherent in high-stakes competition, and the profound consequences of cultural and economic pressures. The final lesson is both sobering and instructive. Endurance is not inherently virtuous if it comes at the expense of health, transparency, or long-term well-being. Silence can be both a shield and a shackle. Courage manifests not only in performance, but also in honesty, reflection, and the reclamation of narrative. The rookie's story exemplifies these tensions, providing insight into the lived experience of professional athletes and the systemic forces that govern their choices. It is a story that challenges assumptions, exposes hidden realities, and illuminates the interplay between human ambition and institutional expectation. As we close this chapter, it is clear that the NFL, like any institution, is defined as much by its culture and systems as by its spectacle. Understanding the human cost of the game through the lens of one rookie, one injury, and one season offers a crucial perspective on resilience, risk, and responsibility. The league continues to evolve, but the stories of hidden suffering remind us that vigilance, accountability, and empathy remain essential. And it is about the need for understanding, reform, and respect for the human beings who give everything on the field, often in silence and at great personal cost. The rookie who played on a broken spine survived, endured, and ultimately revealed the truth. His journey exposes the forces that shaped his decisions, the costs of silence, and the resilience required to navigate both injury and identity. But beyond his individual story, it is a call to reckon with the culture, the economics, and the human consequences of professional football. It is a reminder that behind every helmet is a person, and that every play carries with it risks, choices, and consequences that extend far beyond the game. His story, and those like it, demand reflection, empathy, and a commitment to understanding the true price of the sport we celebrate. It is in this space of reflection that the documentary finds its ultimate purpose: to honor endurance without glorifying risk, to illuminate hidden truths without sensationalizing them, and to ensure that the human beings behind the helmets are recognized, understood, and respected. In telling this story, we witness the fragile balance between ambition and vulnerability, performance and survival, culture and consequence. And in witnessing it, we are challenged to carry forward awareness, empathy, and responsibility so that the next generation of athletes can navigate the game with knowledge, integrity, and safety as guiding principles. The narrative concludes not with triumph in the traditional sense, but with understanding. Not with victory, but with insight. The rookie survived, learned, and shared his truth. And in that truth lies the enduring lesson. Professional football is as much a human story as it is a spectacle, and it is through these human stories that the full meaning of the sport and the lives it shapes can be truly grasped.